All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the June 6, 2022 Grants Pass City Council Workshop. And first up today is the Urban Campground contract. I have an extra copy of the presentation. Is anyone missing it? Okay.
All right, good morning, Council. I have a presentation for you today for the most updated draft of the Urban Campground contract with AllCare. It's a continuation of the conversation from May 23rd, in which I was not present. So kind of just to kick it off, the intent last week was for me to be here, obviously, and to go line by line with the contract up there to make changes in real time. I'm not going to be doing that today because the change, I watched the video, I saw the changes that were recommended. So I've integrated them into the presentation and integrated most of the changes into the contract. So anything that's highlighted in the contract language is meant for council discussion and or approval. So I'm going to start with the very first paragraph, paragraph 1, which is the definition section. It defines the specific terms. So the urban campground definition means the real property designated and made available to unhoused individuals for camping on a temporary basis, whether by tent, trailer, pallet shelter, automobile, or recreational vehicle. So there's a councilor suggestion to add tiny homes to this urban campground definition, which I want to note was a definition that didn't exist prior to the last two drafts of the contract. In the past, I had had this contract drafted for affordable housing, and then I received council direction to make it more specific to an urban campground. So I created that urban campground definition. And so wanted to have council kind of discuss what they wanted involved with that definition. I think the mayor had mentioned last week that pallet houses, or pallet shelters, my mistake, should be included. And so the definition for affordable housing has not changed. This is the definition that I've been using since I started with these contracts, both the ARPA iteration and the state funds iteration, which covers any dwelling. It says it includes an urban campground, transitional housing, or any dwelling. So that covers quite a bit, but it's going to be up to council to see if you're going to want to make changes to that definition. Are there any questions so far?
Did you want us to discuss as we move through this?
I think for clarity's sake, it would probably be easier to do that.
Okay. Val?
I don't know that we need to put tiny homes in there because I think tiny homes is a different thing than an urban campground. Personally, I'm happy to see the pallet shelters because I know we have pallet shelters out there to be utilized, and so it makes sense that that would be a part of it. My interpretation is as tiny homes would be under affordable housing, and if the campground were not utilized and they moved into affordable housing options, that tiny homes would belong there. those are my thoughts.
I guess one question to ask might be, do you have an issue with tiny homes being used on that site, or that they could be simultaneous to an urban campground, you know, with the more temporary shelters? I think the idea is just maybe to not limit unnecessarily what it could be used for. Brian?
So I think, according to the slideshow, sorry, I got a little cold, but according to the slideshow, this was a suggestion from me. But when we first talked about this last year with Mark Bartholomew in the first draft, that language was in there in this definition. So somehow it got taken out at some point, and it didn't get taken out from us. So it's not a suggestion for it to be put in there. It's more, why isn't it in there when it was in there originally? And I don't necessarily think it needs to be in there at this point. I might actually ask the ACCF representatives what their opinion is, if that's appropriate. But I'm not totally sure if it's appropriate for it to be in there or not.
Doug or Jed, did you have a suggestion?
My suggestion would be, if I understand this correct, Augustus, the tiny home term, if we have 3 bullets down, you have highlighted any dwelling.
Right.
If that's in the language, then that covers tiny homes. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
So yes, that's in the definition of affordable housing. So the definition for affordable housing reads, and it means an urban campground, transitional housing, or any dwelling that occupying households can obtain for less than 30% of its gross income.
Okay.
So I believe that it's covered
Right,
under that
so-
any dwellings.
It's redundant then, or it's unnecessary.
But it's not redundant with regards to the urban campground definition.
That's correct. So the urban campground definition, there was, at least from what I could find, there was no urban campground definition initially, because when I initially put these contracts together, it was written to encompass everywhere where you see affordable housing, everywhere you see an urban campground in this contract used to read affordable housing. And then I received council direction to, instead of having this be for affordable housing, to be specifically for an urban campground. And then I made up the urban campground definition because I didn't find anything in our records that indicated that there was a specific definition for urban campground. So it was my attempt to try to capture the spirit of what council had been asking for.
I see. So given that,
So I think the way this is written right now, the funds would be used to purchase an urban campground, and that would not include being able to have any tiny homes on the site.
At least for the first 6 years.
Okay, so I guess the question is it important to either All Care Foundation or to the council to include or exclude tiny homes from an urban campground site?
We would like it included.
Okay.
The more latitude we have to develop a second phase or a phase 2, where we might transition somebody from a tent site to a pallet shelter to a something else, we'd like to have the option of determining what that something else is.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, council, are you interested in including tiny home in the definition? Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. I totally understand what Val was saying, but I really I can't see any disadvantage to including tiny homes in there for the reasons that Doug just mentioned. It just, I don't see any disadvantage to include it. I think it should be included.
I'm going to pick on you next, Rick. What do you think?
That would be fine.
Okay. Joel, include it?
I think it would be okay. Yeah.
Okay. Val?
Yeah, after listening to
Kurt?
yes.
Yes.
Brian? DJ's on the phone?
Sure.
Okay. Let's go ahead and add tiny home to that definition of urban campground.
All right. All right. So moving on to paragraph 4, which is the timeline regarding the dissemination of funds. The discussion point here was to disseminate the funds to all care within 30 days. There's been a suggestion from one of the counselors to reduce that time to 14 days. It's really at council's discretion. I think that City Manager Kubik had stated last week that really the check for funds can be issued at almost any time. So it's really, whether it's 30 days or 14 days, it acts as just a guideline for when the money is supposed to be disseminated, as in no later than that date. And so I believe in our discussions with All Care, there was no initial objection. So this is really dependent on what council wants to do.
Okay. You don't have a strong preference? Does anybody on council want to make an argument for 14 instead of 30? Joel?
Well, I was going to make the opposite argument, just to our due diligence in terms of buying the property and title search and all those type of things. If there's any vacation time and stuff like that, the difference between 14 days and 30 days to make sure it's done right is a small price to pay, I think, from my perspective.
Rick?
I would also endorse the 30 days just because it gives flexibility and doesn't put undue pressure on people. As Joel said, you know, if you rush things too fast, sometimes it lends itself for errors. And since this is not involving just one or two people, but different people putting contracts together and processing of it, I think the 30 days is still reasonable. Thank you.
Okay, council, are we okay with leaving it at 30? Okay, leave it at 30.
All right. So now we're moving to paragraph 6.1. This was a request from All Care to establish buffer zones from schools depending on zoning classification. So that's 1,000 feet buffer if established in a commercial zone, 750 feet buffer if established in a business park zone, and 500 feet buffer if established in an industrial zone.
Okay, because what we had discussed before was 1,000 feet regardless of the zoning. It was just 1,000 feet from a school.
I believe that it was actually, it might have been 500 feet, excluding the school that's at the Juvenile Justice Center.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure it was,
It may have been 1,000 feet.
feet on the
Yeah, I
schools.
don't have the prior draft in front of me.
okay. So council, discussion on reducing the buffer zones if it's within a business park or industrial zone. Does anyone have an issue with that? No hands going up.
I do.
DJ, go ahead.
So the issue that I'm having is in these industrial business park zones, they are immediately adjacent to other different zones. So we can't think about these zonings as being isolated zones that aren't adjacent to residential or otherwise. So I'd like to keep it standard.
Brian?
I haven't, I don't know yet where I stand on this. I think the reason that All Care Foundation is suggesting this is they may have a potential site that does not meet the 1,000 feet. I don't think that it's appropriate to get into those details maybe at this time, but last time we got this far, you know, the public was not happy about a site that was less than 1,000 feet from a school, and this would allow for that to happen. So I just want to make sure we're all aware of that situation. That said, I can see arguments both ways.
Rick?
So I guess just for clarification on 6.1, it just says property shall be buffered from a public or private school, but I'm not seeing as an itemized definition in here that school is listed specifically separate. I mean, it refers to recreation, daycare, industrial, business park, and so forth. So
I think it's the first line, if I'm understanding your question correctly. It's the first line of 6.1. It says the real property shall be buffered from any traditional public or private school. And then the buffers that I just listed that were suggested by All Care are the respective buffers depending on the zoning from a traditional school, public school or private school.
So I'm still confused. So then is the distance figure listed here or not listed here?
The old distance, which may have been 1,000 feet, is not currently listed here. That was just in general, like across the board. So I don't think it's listed here. So I guess that would be a question for council too, is if you want to accept these buffers based on zones and then still have a baseline buffer for any, so for example, 1,000 feet, if it's not a business park zone or established in an industrial zone.
I think the clarity for that would be better.
Okay.
That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Your clarity lost me there.
Yeah,
I'm not
I
sure.
just lost the clarity too.
I mean, previously we had discussed having it be 1,000 feet from a school and no zoning, was part of that. So what this does is it has it be 1,000 feet in a commercial zone, but then would reduce it if the campground is in a business park zone to 750 feet. If the campground's in an industrial zone, 500 feet from the school. So
500 feet on 6.141, right?
6.13 says 500
13.
feet buffer if the campground is in an industrial zone. And then 6.141 just excludes the Newbridge High School because that one is inside the Oregon Youth Authority. It's actually in a gated.
But where do we, I'm still confused, where do we come up? I realize in other documents, the 1,000 feet appears. Why isn't the 1,000 feet in here also for schools?
It is.
It is. It's on the bottom of the second page. 1,000 feet for if the campground is within a commercial zone.
Where are you reading?
6.11.
The bottom of the page.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's breaking it out further. If it's a school, if it's in the different zones, then it varies the distance. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And reducing it, specifically reducing it for business park and industrial zones,
Right.
of which we have very few
But
spaces.
I just thought it should be, it's picking out business park, picking out industrial, picking out commercial, but doesn't list, the base is no longer listed.
Well, it's the 1,000
Because
feet.
what you're saying.
Because it can't be in a residential
It
zone.
can't be in a residential zone.
Those
So,
are the 3 zones that are allowed in.
Yeah.
So we've listed those 3 zones and just provided that the base used to be 1,000 feet.
Okay,
So now there's an exception for business park and there's an exception for industrial potentially at council. So
okay, that clears it up. Thank you.
Joel, then Val.
Well, building on what Brian said, the site-specific things are hard to say. Just a suggestion, you could say 1,000 feet or is agreed to by parties. If there's a specific location that would require less than 1,000 feet and it's socially acceptable, why wouldn't we do that? If it was 200 feet and it was socially acceptable, why wouldn't we do that? And so it would give the flexibility that if both parties agreed, we could agree to that. The thing with having it going in, it's automatically going to make some properties excluded. If you have a figure there of 500 feet or 1,000 feet or whatever, and it's going to have some other properties that are going to be automatically included without the site specificity being examined. So I'm kind of a site-specific guy. And there's going to be places where the 500 feet is going to be appropriate, and there's going to be places where the 500 feet wouldn't be, and where you're looking at, I'm sure it would be appropriate and it would be agreed to. So I would say keep it at 1,000 feet unless otherwise agreed to by both parties, and let's be reasonable with each other and support each other.
So you're suggesting adding some sort of clause that would allow for an exception to the 1,000-foot buffer?
Both parties agree, yeah.
Okay. Val, then Brian?
In a perfect world, I think that would happen, but I think we've run across a whole lot of people who aren't agreeing, and that's been part of the issue that we have been running across. I personally think in a business owner's industrial zone, most schools are in a commercial or residential. And so I have no problem with just saying, hey, you know, business park and industrial is where you want it, so that's where it should be. I'm a little confused by DJ's comment because I didn't completely understand what he was opposing it for when he brought up the residential side of it. So maybe clarification on what he was talking about in terms of that I'd be interested in knowing and understanding what he was saying because I didn't understand that. But personally, I do feel that a business park or an industrial zone is where most people would prefer us to have it. So I just kind of feel like that is something that sometimes we're going to have to make some concessions, and there's no way we're ever going to make everybody happy. We're just going to have to, you know, make a rule and stand by it and move forward.
I'm happy to clarify.
Go ahead.
So, when residential areas, let's just use business park for example, it's common to have business park that runs right up next to residential. Perhaps we've addressed this before and that might be part of the confusion. However, my concern is you have a business park property that is directly adjacent residential. How would that be addressed with the current buffer recommendations?
Well, the site would have to be...
My question's for Augustus.
It doesn't appear that that circumstance has been addressed. So that might be a better question for Mr. Walker, honestly.
The site would need to be
I
within
don't think
500 feet. The site would
That's a good question for
DJ,
Mr. Walker either. So
DJ, call to order. DJ,
What?
the site...
I'm clarifying.
Okay, allow me to answer, please, first, and then you can continue.
You don't have the answer to my question, Sarah. So what my concern is we need to address where those zones run up against residential zones, which would really be the only concern because residential zone is the only way that it's not permitted. So a buffer around residential zones that swings into sort of a bridge gap between two zones, that would be appropriate, and that would actually address my concerns with varying buffer zones from business park or industrial or otherwise. Because unless we do that, we could very well run into a circumstance where we have a urban campground directly adjacent to an apartment complex or what have you.
I think I see what you're saying, Counselor. So one way that this can be addressed is by putting a buffer zone a certain number of feet from a residential zone. So
yeah, I believe that to be appropriate.
Okay. So if we have 1,000 feet buffer in an established commercial zone, it would be up to council to decide how many feet they would want to have or allow the possibility for an urban campground to be from a residential zone.
Brian?
I was actually going to agree with Joel's idea. I thought having the 1,000 feet with, if both parties decide on a specific site that doesn't meet that criteria, I thought that would be a good way to go.
Any further discussion on this one? Kind of had a little bit of opposing ideas here, I guess. One would be to add another buffer zone from residential, and the other would be to keep it at 1,000 and provide a possible exception. we can think about it for a little bit, and
Okay, we can
that's
come
that's
back to
probably
it.
the most complicated of the decisions we'll have to make on this today, so if you all want to
Okay.
think it over. Aaron?
Just as one thing to add, and Mr. Walker might want to add also to this, but from a standpoint of the foundation, having it 1,000 and then maybe mutually agreed upon would make it a little more difficult and cumbersome process of identifying a property versus having something already called out. It takes a lot of work and behind the scenes in contacting properties, developing a relationship, coming up with a strategy for negotiations. And if we're doing that, on a piece of property that we're not sure would be mutually agreed upon, that's going to take a lot more potential effort from the foundation's part.
So, sorry.
I guess that leads me to the question of, could you add residential to commercial, or would that be too,
I think residential might have to be its own, because the way that, I mean, this is, and of course, this is a draft. So if we wanted to do, what this is saying is that if the urban campground is established in a commercial zone, then it has to be 1,000 feet from the school. The other clause, the clause involving residential would be a buffer from any property or land zoned residential.
okay.
So I think it would probably be best served by being a different clause.
And it could be the same footage if you so desired. It could be school and residential zones. Here are your buffers.
Rob?
Yeah, I pretty much completely agree with the point that Aaron just clarified. I really don't, I think it would be potentially very, very unnecessarily complex for All Care Foundation to then go look for properties. Also, when it comes back to council, it could just be another layer of confusion, quite frankly. I'd like to give them very clear parameters. They go out property hunting. When they got it, they got it. And basically the council is, our job is already done. We finished. We're done with our job. They go do their job, rather than have a gray area where we go back and forth. Adding an additional clause for residential, I guess, makes a lot of sense. But again, that would be hard and fast, and All Care Foundation would know what they're looking for. As soon as we leave the room, everybody's on their mission, and the council's done their job. To me, that's the cleanest way moving forward.
Brian?
My one concern with the buffer on the residential zone is if we set that number too high, all of these other zones are kind of surrounded by residential, and it's really going to cut down the potential site options for them. So, you know, if it's even 500 feet, that's really going to constrain the potential sites. So I just want us to be mindful of that if we decide to put that in there.
So we do have smaller zones. We have the 100 feet from a daycare facility or 300 feet from a park. So maybe within that range might be something worth considering. Brian?
I mean, I would just throw out 200 feet from a residential area, so it's not too restrictive, but yet it's keeping it, you know, a fair distance away.
Council want to consider 200 feet? Doug?
Yeah, please, thank you. Before you all decide that might be something you want to consider, it'd be lovely to look at the maps and see just what that eliminates, because most of our commercial business park industrial is right up against residential. And there's very few lots within those zones. We just don't have that kind of land zoning around here. So we may be, it may sound wonderful and may be a great idea, but I think it's going to end up, what's going to end up happening is there's going to be no available lots.
Yeah, and Aaron, I'm wondering, so there's a state law that is changing, I don't know if it's already changed, that would allow shelters to be placed pretty much anywhere.
Yeah, that was an emergency clause, action by the state. It does have a sunset. I'm not exact, I think it was extended for like another year or something, but it's not a permanent thing in nature.
Okay.
And that's,
Okay, just wanted to clarify. DJ?
So what Doug just said actually really concerns me. So basically what we've done by identifying zoning is that the intent of all care would be within the current guidelines, they could put a campground or what have you on business park, industrial or commercial, and it'd be directly adjacent to residential. And I mean to tell you that that's not acceptable for me. We could look at maps. 200 feet isn't enough in my opinion. 300 feet is a little better. 200 feet is a couple lots. So I think that this is definitely something that we need to do, as it was mentioned before. The attempt on N Street was a disaster, and we need to try to prevent a disaster. And I'd like to also just shine on what Rob said. The ultimate goal, from my idea, is likened to Rob's, what he just said. I would like to set it and just forget it. Write the check, meet the guidelines, and just feel good about what we did. But we certainly need to address this residential buffer zone.
Rick?
I have some, I would say, hesitations or concerns when we are protecting the residential zone, which needs to be protected, but you could have a river in between, or you could have the only access into that commercial or industrial site is by a separate road, and there's no connection to the residential area. And I'm not saying we want to put those exceptions in this ordinance, but what's bothering me now, I think we need a buffer, but I think we also need flexibility when we look at each piece of property. And I hate to make this ordinance or this draft so complicated that it eliminates a lot of the potential properties that could be viable just because it's the only way you can get in there. Thank you.
Okay, so that almost suggests adding the exception that Joel had discussed previously, that we may be open to some exceptions. I mean, I think you can do both. You know, you can have a buffer zone and you can have an exclusion clause if you were inclined to do that. But it sounds like right now people are talking about somewhere in the 200 to 300 foot range for residential zone buffer. Brian?
I mean, we could put a placeholder in there. I would like to look at the maps and see how restrictive that actually is, because if it's too restrictive and it's not going to work, then we need to think about it some more.
Rob?
So when we have talked about a buffer, you know, when you think about residential, clearly no one, if they didn't sign up for it, would want their home or their property to share a property line with an urban campground. So, you know, the question would be whatever that buffer is going to be. But we never, I don't think we've ever discussed what that actual boundary would look like. So whether it's an 8-foot fence, does it have slats in the fence that you can't see through, that kind of thing. So to some degree, that also affects how close I would be comfortable having a property, you know, near the property line, so to speak, near the urban campground's property line. So I don't think we have any language in here that discusses what the actual boundary is supposed to look like, do we?
No, and neither is there language that determines what that buffer, where that buffer starts, whether it's from the edge of the property or from a certain set of buildings within the campground. So that's, in terms of the fencing, in terms of like the materials used, whether we're using chain link fence or whether they're using fencing with slats or a wooden fence. I suppose that would be up to council as to whether you wanted to include that in this agreement.
Can I interject? Augustus, it's in the planning code. 6-foot visual blocking fence is a requirement of planning code. So
6-foot visual what?
fence,
Visual blocking, so it could
visual
be
blocking
like,
fence is in the planning code. So the planning code would require it, even though the grant language doesn't require it. Yeah.
okay, does that resolve that? Let's put 300 for a placeholder, and then it sounds like we're going to need to have another discussion where we look at maps and buffer zones and see what, how those will be affected before we finalize.
Okay, and just to be clear, this is a 300-foot buffer from a residential zone as a placeholder, correct?
Yes.
Okay. All right, moving to paragraph 6.3. This is going to be 300 feet from any recreational facilities or public parks. For some reason, it was 200. I thought I changed it. It is now completely changed. Are there any questions on that?
I think we're good there.
Okay. Last one, paragraph 8.1. Now this outlines the restrictive covenant draft, which I've provided to each and every one of you. It's up to you whether you want to discuss this now. I think it might be best to go through the rest of the presentation and then to come back to this since it's a separate document, if that's okay with you.
Works for me.
Okay, so that we'll discuss 8.2, which is also part of the restrictive covenant soon. So paragraph 9 was a suggestion from Councilor King that I saw in the video that adds case management to all care services in the provision of this urban campground. So what's in the presentation, what's in the contract is what it would look like if council wanted to adopt this change. So I'm wondering if there's any questions about that.
Well, I would like to know all CARE's feeling on that, or Doug, do you have any objection to that?
Yeah, my only objection is I can't answer that because Rogue Retreat is going to be subcontracted to provide that. So they would understand the definitions of those things and I don't. So I can't really answer your question on that one, on that issue. I'd have to ask for clarification from them.
Sure, so you need time to talk with them about it then before?
Yeah, if
Okay.
Augustus could send me the draft, the most current draft,
I may have one over
okay,
here.
and
Well,
then I
that
can,
sounds
email
reasonable.
it to them.
Yeah, that'll allow you to coordinate with your partners.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna, oh, sorry.
Brian?
It seemed to me like the case management was kind of baked into what was already there with transitioning individuals out of homelessness. So I just wasn't sure if it was necessary since the primary focus is to transition individuals out of homelessness, and that's already in there.
And I think to Councilor De La Grange's point, transitioning out of homelessness, I think implies a form of case management. Transitioning out of homelessness is very difficult if there's not individualized help to make sure that somebody's able to maintain that status of having shelter and making sure that they're. So I think that Councilor De La Grange's point is sound in terms of what's already in the contract.
Rick?
I just wonder if the word case management adds a little more emphasis in there, because transitioning can just be a word, where case management sounds like you actually have a program.
I think we're all on the same page here. It doesn't, it adds some specificity that maybe doesn't need to be there, but it doesn't necessarily hurt anything either. Rob?
Well, I definitely like the words case management in there because we've gone on that assumption from day one with these discussions that is part of it. But I think future councils or the public in general doesn't necessarily know that is our assumption. So I think it clarifies what our target is for anyone in the future that's looking for this that hasn't been following all these discussions. So I would be in favor of keeping those words in there.
Val?
Yeah, I would, I was actually going to say, add services involved with transitioning individuals or something, but I think it needs to be in there for the same reason, is I think when you're out there talking to the public, that's part of what scares them to death, is just having a campground where people are transitioning. Well, transitioning is pretty vague, and so I think it's important that we say that there will be services involved, and case management kind of gives that sense that there will be specific services involved in the campground.
Great. I think we're good with leaving it in there.
With leaving it in there? Okay.
Mayor, can I add something?
Sure.
In some meetings in the past from one or two service providers, UCAN, I think it was that, is they work on some very specific definitions. And so the term case management may cause a wrinkle for somebody. And so don't get stuck on the term case management. There may be another term that Rogue Retreat would prefer to use that describes a broader thing of services.
Services is services associated with transitioning individuals out of homelessness as a suggestion.
Well, I would just run it by.
Yeah, let me run it by
Rogue-
them.
Rogue
I'm just saying,
Retreat
don't get stuck on
and
that term.
not try to make up their minds for them.
Right.
We're not going to be done with this today, so we'll have to provide you with a copy that you can show to your board and Rogue Retreat and see if you catch anything before we finalize it.
Okay, so then for now, I'll leave that in there just as a placeholder like we did for the other provision. Okay, placeholder. All right, the next paragraph is 9.2.1. Adding that no person will be denied services or be discriminated against in the provision of services based on race, color, national origin, sex, adding gender identity, religion, handicap, or age.
Questions? I think we're good with that one.
All right. Okay, so paragraph 10.1. Now this is a remedy for termination of, this is the city's option to purchase the property for $1, excluding the appraised value of any capital improvements made upon the property by grantee, other than those paid for by the city. And so 10.1 says that the city's option to purchase the real property triggers upon the city or grantee's termination of the contract, of the agreement, or upon mutual termination. So this is kind of associated with 12.1, which I wanted to discuss with council last week, just as a set of draft provisions. So it's associated with paragraph 17, which states what the, how termination is to take place and what all care's rights are if the agreement is terminated. So I wanted to bring that to council because I think that this will be affected if you determine that a termination for convenience is inappropriate. I just wanted to discuss it last week. This wasn't anything that was going to be set in stone. I just wanted to make council aware of their rights and aware of why, it was highlighted for a conversation. So I'll get back to that in a second because the 10.1 and 12 are linked. So 10.2 is amended to read a material breach by grantee pursuant to paragraph 15, which defines what a material breach is. And I removed material breach by the city. So there was concern from a councilor that including a material breach by the city and then allowing the city to purchase the property back for $1, including, and then giving repayment to all care for their capital improvements might incentivize the city to materially breach the contract immediately. But as a matter of contract law, what would end up happening is that if a city or for any entity decided to materially breach a contract for the purposes of exploiting the remedies that are in a contract, a court would look very unfavorably on that. And so as a practice, that's not allowed, and courts have provided for that. So I just wanted to make that clear because there's a lot of things that would have to go wrong for the city to materially breach this particular agreement. And so I just felt it important. I took out a material breach by the city. It's now going to read a material breach by the grantee pursuant to paragraph 15. Are there any questions on that? Okay. All right, I'm going to move on to 11.2. There was a question from Councilor Pell about the definition of proceeds, or what proceeds meant in the context of this contract. This is referring to All Care's right to sell the property after 6 years, with the caveat that they reinvest the proceeds from the sale into affordable housing in the city of Grants Pass within the urban growth boundary. Within the context of this contract, it was meant to be net proceeds, so proceeds after taxes, fees, escrow payments, everything that's associated with the sale of a property have been deducted from the final amount. I think there was a question that arose as to whether council wanted to have that capture gross proceeds. So the way that would work is that if All Care sold the property for $2 million, after $200,000 in fees, they would realize 1.8. So instead of that 1.8, if this council was going to require that they reinvest their gross proceeds, they would be expected to invest the full $2 million that they sold the property for, not necessarily what they realized from the sale. So that's how that would work. Are there any questions about that?
Rob?
So is there, in any judicial universe, is there a way that proceeds could be construed to be the 800,000? In other words, over and above the million? Because proceeds can also be called, we'll say, the profit. So 800,000 could also be called the proceeds, and maybe they would only have to reinvest 800 rather than 1.8, is my concern.
I see. Yeah, there's a way you could do that. You could just say net proceeds from the sale.
Brian?
I was kind of under the impression that since we were planning on giving them a grant for $1 million, that we should really only be beholding them to $1 million once the property is sold. Anything above and beyond that has nothing to do with the grant that we've given them. So, so I'm not sure it's appropriate to do that.
Rob?
Well, I think that the picture that comes up in my mind is if property values went up 100% in 10 years, the $1 million that we're going to give them is only going to buy 50% of what it buys today. So the city ends up getting 50%. If they decide to move, we get 50% of the value that we're giving them. Whether if they had to reinvest the full $2 million, then we're going to have a similarly valued property in the future. So that would be my concern, is that it doesn't consider property appreciation. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
DJ?
Yeah, I feel compelled to say that I'm categorically opposed to giving a nonprofit organization the liberty to capture proceeds from an investment that came from the city. And that's what we're talking about. This clause is basically demonstrating to anybody that after a certain amount of time, they can sell the property and do whatever they want with it under this umbrella of affordable housing. I'm not okay with that. These are taxpayers' money. This is the city's money. This is an investment of the city to improve the social status of those that need it in this community. And what's happening here is we're talking about a slight as far as this grant now becoming an investment opportunity for a nonprofit using taxpayers' money. And I don't like it. I'm not comfortable with it. Unfortunately, I think I'm a minority here in discussing this. But negotiating anything out of the entire proceeds for reinvestment for this purpose, I'm not even okay with that. Because I'm not okay with the very core of what we're talking about here. And I'll say it one more time. We are talking about allowing a nonprofit to gain benefit from the investment and the growth thereof of the city's grant money, and I'm not okay with it.
Rob?
So DJ, I don't fully understand what your point is. So, well, I guess I understand the words, but the picture, if, let's just say for round figures, we're giving a grant for $1 million. 10 years from now, we no longer need an urban campground. It was so successful, we moved people along, whatever. The property can now has a real market value of $2 million. What are you suggesting happens to that property if it's worth $2 million in 10 years and we no longer need an urban campground, but we would do better with tiny homes or some other facility? So what are you suggesting happens at that point?
What I suggest what would happen is this remains if that goes liquid, then it remains the property of the city. It gets paid back. Whatever investment that the city put in can come back out. Then the council at that time can say, oh geez, look at us, we doubled our money. Now we can do something else with another nonprofit of some kind. But allowing that authority, basically, we're writing them a check for $1 million, and using your example, they're going to turn it into $2 million in a matter of a couple of years and do whatever they want with it. I think that it should be returned to the city. I just think it's absolutely absurd that we're even talking about allowing somebody to benefit from this investment from the city. Yeah, there you go. Without further discussion and really mulling over the implications of that decision, I think it should come right back to the city.
So DJ, when you say allowing them to do whatever they want with it, that actually is spelled out. They're not allowed to do whatever they want with it. It would have to do with affordable housing, and I don't remember the other limitations in the contract language, but it's not as if they could do whatever they want with it. It would still be providing housing for lower income or disadvantaged people in some way. Is that correct, Augustus?
Yes, but what we'll have to do is we have to entertain, okay, at the very instant of the sale of that property and the next instant use of that money, yes, okay? But then from there moving forward, I can easily entertain a way that somebody could make a bunch of money off of this investment. There are holes in this contract that anybody in my business could see that somebody has the opportunity to turn this into a life savings really quick. And that could, and since it could happen, you have to presume that it would happen. So yes, but what you're saying, Rob, to clarify, you're entirely correct. At the instant of that sale, and then the following instant of what they do with it, sure. But where are the covenants from there? They've doubled the money, they put it in their pocket, they've reinvested it, and now they have affordable housing. They get subsidy from the government, and now all of a sudden they're making more money off of that money. That's what could happen. I mean, I wish I was a nonprofit getting $1 million from the city right now. I could turn it into 10 in 10 years, because that's what will happen. We have the potential of making somebody a lot of money here by seeding the initial investment from the city, and then we don't have any jurisdiction over that amount or over X amount of time. If we're clever, we have to entertain that as being a possibility.
Brian?
Do we have the ability to have a restrictive covenant that's just ongoing as far as these monies are concerned with what, because we have it for the first rollover into a property. Do we have the ability to have that be like for a certain length of time or in perpetuity or?
So there are laws against covenants that are typically in perpetuity. But as to the rest of that question, if we're talking just about the money itself, I'd have to look into that. There is a provision in the contract that does spell out if All Care purchases a subsequent piece of property, then they're going to be required to enter into a similar restrictive covenant that dictates that that property also has to be used for affordable housing. But that really only speaks to subsequent property acquisition and not to the monies itself. As to how to control how All Care uses the money, I don't mean to use the word control, but that's kind of what I'm eliciting from Councillor Fazier's statements. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head.
Okay, well, we have discussed this issue before, and I think that council generally understands that the funds as written would be used to provide an urban campground for 6 years, and that after that time, the funds would roll forward into affordable housing. And so I think one way of looking at it is that is our investment, is the 6 years, and then potentially either continuing on as an urban campground into the future, or becoming affordable housing, but that it's, that the community is getting that investment out of the money. Joel, then DJ.
I was going to bring up a different topic associated with this, so maybe it's better that we finish DJ's discussion and Rob and Brian's discussion before we move on to mine.
Okay, DJ?
Okay, well, what was said is the council's already decided to do this, and so this is what we're going to do. No, that is not correct. We are still working over this contract. This is the first time that it's really been demonstrated and understood what we're doing with this investment, and we need to look into loopholes. I'm not an attorney, but I know they're there, and we need to find them. We need to find out what legal basis they're standing on, and we need to work it over to do whatever possible to prevent what I see something as obviously impending regarding this investment. So that's all I have to say about that.
Is it on this topic? Val?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I know for a fact that the laws regarding affordable housing are pretty strict. And I will say that as we move forward with our CET money or any money coming down, that they are very strict. And that's what we're finding out as we go through. It's not an easy thing to, when you're guaranteeing affordable housing, you're guaranteeing things for 30 years at a time. So I understand, DJ's concerns, but I think I'm not quite sure they're as warranted, because once again, making investment in affordable housing is important, and it is very expensive, and there are very stringent rules on how that money can be used.
Brian?
Yeah, after all this discussion, I would say that the language of 11.2 sounds fine to me. I think maybe it should just call out net proceeds, since that's what it seems to refer to, but maybe just have that be explicit if that's the way council decides to go.
Joel?
So I had an additional concern. I would like to insert in there affordable/workforce housing. We don't know what the situation is going to be like 6-10 years from now, and trying to decide what that is. At this point in time, we could be not doing what's optimum for the future of our city. So I would add /workforce. The other thing that I'm thinking is, and this came up at our workshop, and it was actually by somebody that was originally opposed to the urban campground, saying that after it's no longer needed, which hopefully we're going to be successful as a city, we're going to make a difference to people, that we can turn it into a park as a celebration, and it has a use for all people. And so, given that, if there's no demand, we're going to invest a significant amount of other funds into this, from ARPA, from urban renewal, from the money from the state. We don't know what the situation is going to be 6-8 years from now. Hopefully we've made a big difference. That we have some other options besides already adding to what we have plenty enough of. I don't want to make that decision now, because I don't know what the situation is going to be 6 to 8 years from now. So I would suggest that we have affordable workforce housing, will be invested into affordable workforce housing or other suitable projects for the public good. It doesn't exclude affordable housing, it mentions it specifically, but then it also gives us the option that if the situation 6 to 10 years from now is different than what we have that option. And we can celebrate it with a public park.
All right, let's tackle a couple of things here. First, Augustus, the difference between, in your opinion, between all proceeds and all net proceeds?
So putting net proceeds would just make it more explicit. I don't think that there's a
That
problem
would be
with adding that.
the entire proceeds of the sale, not just limiting to the
No,
million?
so the net proceeds would be the proceeds of the sale after any fees associated with selling the property have been satisfied.
Okay, but it wouldn't limit it to the million?
No, it would be what, so if All Care, just for example, purchases a piece of property that costs $1 million exactly, right? We give $1 million, and after all of that, they operate an urban campground for 6 years, and then in that 6 years, the property appreciates to $2 million. And they sell it, realize $1.8 million for the sale, from the sale after all the fees. They would be, the way that this contract is written is that the $1.8 million would be subject to reinvestment into affordable housing in the city.
That's if we add net or without net?
That's with or without net.
With or without, doesn't
Yes.
matter to you?
No, yeah, it doesn't matter to me. I think that it would
Okay.
be, just to make it clear, I'll just put net proceeds in there.
Okay, but it means the same?
Yes.
Okay, then let's go ahead and add net. The second thing, I guess, Kurt had your hand up. Were you going to comment on the workforce housing? Because that was my
Well,
next.
I'm not sure what the definition of workforce housing is. But before you give me that answer, I was just going to say that, sadly, I somewhat agreed with DJ, but as I'm sitting here thinking about it, we're getting this money from the state. So we're not, we have to be good stewards of tax money, but we're not worried about just our local tax money. This is everybody in the state's tax money. And if we're exchanging money for value and we're getting a good trade in that, then we should be happy. And what we're doing is we're giving $1 million, and the value we should be getting back is a program to transition people out of homelessness. And that part of that would be getting them into affordable housing at the end. And the fact that we would lose control after it no longer is a urban campground, as long as we're getting value back, that's all I care about. So I think we're talking in circles about nothing.
Yeah, I was going to ask either Augustus or Aaron. So we are receiving this money from the state through a grant, and what are the specific requirements? Does it need to be affordable housing?
So it's programs to alleviate homelessness, including affordable housing. Okay. So yeah, I wasn't going to bring it up now. I was going to wait too, but workforce housing, I believe, is separate and distinct from affordable housing. Workforce housing, I don't think has income caps. I could be mistaken about that, but to my knowledge, there are no income caps for workforce housing. It's just housing that's provided for a particular company or that they use to provide housing for their workers.
Okay, so then that would also exclude a park use or something. The funds need to be used for something that meets the terms of the state grant that we've received.
That's correct.
Okay. Anything further on that topic for the moment?
I could add clarification to the workforce. I asked Sam, and he's a little bit more versed in those things. So definition changes based on what government entity is describing the program, but generally workforce is 80 to 100% of AMI, area median income, and then the requirement is 30% of whatever that is, would be what they would pay for rent. So that's definition of workforce. But Augustus is right, affordable is not necessarily workforce. So if the grant from ARPA or whatever the agency is says affordable, it may exclude workforce.
From the state.
Okay,
Not
yeah,
from
this
the
one's
state.
from the state.
Not
Okay, I think we've made it beyond 11.2. We're adding the word net.
And you're also adding the phrase within the urban growth boundary of the city of Grants Pass, just to make it clear that any funds reinvested have to be reinvested into the urban growth boundary area of City of Grants Pass.
Okay. And did you
Doug had
address 11.3 yet? I don't think so.
I just had a quick question on
Yeah.
11.2. If we say within the urban growth boundary, that implies also within the city limits, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's,
Should we add city limits or UGB and/or UGB?
yeah, how about and/or, because one is a very specific thing, and it doesn't necessarily include the other.
Yeah, originally it was city limits, and then I suggested this, but I think my intent was that it was everything. You know,
Yeah.
they could invest it anywhere in the city, including the urban growth boundary.
So originally it was just affordable housing within the City of Grants Pass, right? So I'm sorry, how was
So
your-
it's the city limits and/or the UGB, rather
So,
than,
then-
creating a strange ring around the city.
So within the city limits,
Yeah, we can definitely add that. We have other documentation when it comes to agreements between city, county and stuff that states within the urban growth boundary, the city is incorporated within the urban growth boundary also. But if you want the additional clarification, we can add some.
yeah. And then, so 11.3,
Doug
Which-
had another comment, I think. Did you have another comment, Doug? No? Okay.
so 11.3, which isn't in the presentation, my apologies, states that if the grantee purchases alternative real property after selling this initial piece of property, they would be required to execute, and we would record a covenant substantially similar to the covenant described in 8.1, which we'll talk about at the end. So it's a restrictive covenant saying that the property needs to be used for affordable housing. Okay. So paragraph 12 is termination for convenience provision. Now, the intent was to talk about this last week when I wasn't here. City manager got up here. He didn't know what my presentation was going to entail. And so I want to apologize for any sort of confusion on this. This was merely to be a discussion point. This wasn't meant to be any sort of rogue addition to the contract, but I just wanted to make sure that the city council understood its rights and understood what a termination for convenience, which is funnily named because it's anything but convenient, entails, all right? So it's typically a standard term in government contracts, all right? So it's meant to it's meant to retain discretion on the part of the organization to terminate a contract when it's in the government's interest to do so. So an example of that is that where something might happen that's unexpected, where the city has to make a quick decision and say, it's really not in our interest to be in this contract anymore. What that does is it terminates the contract. It doesn't breach it, it terminates it. And then as part of the termination provisions that are outlined in a contract, it dictates how that termination is to take place. So it provides flexibility in a case where the public interest may trump the contractual obligation. Now, kind of similarly to a material breach in terms of taking advantage of termination provisions, this flexibility doesn't necessarily mean that the city can treat the contractor unfairly or enter the contract with the intent to terminate for convenience. So the way a court would look at this, they'd say, all right, what were the intent of the parties who are entering into this contract? And then if there was an indication that one of the parties entered into the contract with the intent to terminate for convenience and to elicit any sort of benefit that might come with the termination, a court's going to determine typically that that contract wasn't entered into in good faith. So we're going to look at that as a bad faith. You're entering the contract in terms of bad faith, and that has its own set of consequences in terms of damages and punitive damages, things of that nature. So as such, any organization is not incentivized in any way, shape, or form to enter into a contract and then without the contract, because we're assuming, right, the parties are entering the contract because they want this agreement to work out. So there's no incentive for the city to, or any organization for that matter, to enter into a contract and then to immediately terminate it for convenience. There's, especially if you're entering into a contract for services like this, where both parties are pretty motivated to get something done. So if you were to keep this termination for convenience provision, all care would be made whole pursuant to paragraph 17. Now, paragraph 17 outlines that the city would have to pay for their demobilization costs, would have to pay for any capital improvements that they've made on the property, and would have to pay for any fees that are associated with their breach, with their termination of contracts and subcontracts to provide services that are commensurate to an urban campground. And so they would be paid also for the services they had rendered to date. To say that a termination for convenience is one of those terms that can be abused by organizations, while it's true and it has happened, your legal counsel would definitely advise you against doing something like that. So council has a number of options, and they can remove the provision altogether, which is perfectly fine. Council can restrict when a termination for convenience may occur. So kind of going back to that point where the parties are motivated to get a deal done, you want to see the contract at least play out. You want to see a property purchased. You want to see all care build the infrastructure out. You want to see people utilizing the campground. So that takes time to happen, right? That takes time to break ground, get everything built, get all of the infrastructure in place. Council can place a restriction on when a termination for convenience may occur. So an example would be a termination for convenience won't be permitted within 3 years from the purchase of the real property. Now, it doesn't need to be from the purchase of the real property. It could be from the opening date, or a date determined by the parties where that's privately negotiated. Another option is that the council can provide extra incentive for all care to accept the provision by paying a monetary penalty for a termination for convenience. You see this sometimes in more commercial contracts where a termination for convenience elicits a fee where the party who terminates for convenience has to pay the other party some sort of penalty, $5,000, $10,000. Doesn't always have to be monetary, but typically is. Or you could do a combination of the two. So I had intended to bring this before council to have this discussion. And it's also good to have the representatives of all care here. When we had discussed this in our meeting, this wasn't discussed as this is a done deal, this is what's happening. My understanding of the discussion was that we would bring it to council. Council would decide what they wanted to do. And with all care's input, we would plot a path forward. So that was the reason that it was included in the contract that you saw last week. It was meant for a discussion. Are there any questions on this?
Joel?
Well, I didn't have a question, I just had an observation. It's in every federal government contract that I've ever administered, and mainly timber sales, and the reason for it was if an endangered or threatened animal moved into a sold timber sale, we could cancel the contract, and we would do so reluctantly, and we would then have to reimburse the purchaser, and he wouldn't have to cut a log. And we would reimburse him millions of dollars. So it was used where it was necessary. So the only thing in my mind, it says, okay, so when would we do that and how would we do that? Well, if there was something with our infrastructure that all of a sudden made it unworkable, or if there was a fire that came through, or that made you you couldn't fulfill your contract. If there was, I don't know what it would be. We don't have threatened and endangered animals on the side of it. Well, we may have, but we don't know about them, and we don't do surveys. I assume that there's none there. So I don't know what the circumstance would be where we would use that. I'm just used to it in every government contract that I've ever administered.
So a circumstance where it could arise is if something happens, if there's a natural disaster of some type. If the city is able to put the property to a better use than all care is with having powers of government, it's hard to see everything that could go wrong. This is a sort of provision that is an emergency use provision only. This is not something that governments want to do at all. This is something that you want to have, that legally you might want to have in your contract and be thankful you never have to use it. So that was really the only rationale for putting it in for your guys' discussion.
Brian?
So I know that this council is operating in good faith with regards to this contract. My concern with that clause is that as soon as next year, a future council could decide they don't like the urban campground, and this would be the clause that they would use to scuttle it. After this clause, we have termination by mutual consent. So if both parties agree to terminate, that's in here. I feel that's totally appropriate. We also have termination and default for cause in here, which is totally appropriate. Termination for convenience does not seem appropriate to me.
And kind of to take the flip side of that is that, yes, this council is operating in good faith. Next council may be operating in good faith. This again is just to keep flexibility intact. If this provision isn't included and something happens down the line, and it's difficult for all of us to kind of look in a crystal ball and see what could go wrong. But if something happens down the line and a future council has the need to exit the contract and all care doesn't want to exit the contract, you're stuck. And so that's something may happen, something may not happen. I think the parties are hoping that this contract gets fulfilled and everything goes well. That's what the parties are hoping for. So again, it's completely up to council. I just wanted to inform you of what this is for, how it's used, and kind of leave it up to council as to how to proceed.
DJ?
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Augustus. I've been very concerned about this for weeks since this recommendation came to place, this termination clause. And to stand up on what Joel said, this is boilerplate contract language. I have never in my entire career, nor had a conversation with anybody that has ever entertained removing this clause. And that's including both parties and contracts, and we're contractors. I need to exaggerate the importance of this clause and basically say it as clear as I possibly can. Removing this clause is downright foolish. And Augustus said it pretty clearly why, and I'm begging you to understand why that is foolish, because anybody would tell you that knows anything about contract law would find it absurd that a party would like to take this clause out of their contract.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks, DJ. As city councilors, we're kind of in a unique position. We're in a different position than Augustus is in, and we're actually in a different position than any of the contractors that DJ references. DJ as a contractor is not in any way, shape, or form trying to represent the best interest of another person he's in a contract with. As city councilors, we're looking out for, we have a fiduciary responsibility to look out for taxpayer dollars. We also have a responsibility to look out for the people, for that matter, to some degree, all care, because we actually represent the entire city. We just are not representing, we'll say, the contract, so to speak. We are representing the people that we're signing the contract with. So that's very much unlike the scenarios DJ just spoke of. So I would want to make sure that this contract, as best as possible, works for us, the city, and also works for the All Care Foundation as well. Because as Kurt said earlier, I mean, we want to get some value out of this, and the value isn't necessarily measured exactly in dollars. It could be more measured in improved human life and that sort of thing. And we're representing the entire entity. So in other words, I'm representing everyone on this side of the dais. I'm also representing everyone on the other side of the podium. So we have a unique situation here, and I don't think a black and white rule necessarily covers that unique situation. You know, I'm leaning towards the removal of that clause because I just don't know that it's fair to All Care. And again, someone could call me foolish or laugh at that concept, and in business that might be true. This is business, but it's also beyond that. It's also humanity. So I'm looking at it from a little bigger perspective, I think, than a businessman might look at a contract deal.
DJ.
Yeah, whereas most of what you say is true, Rob, is that we are council and we need to represent. Taking exception to belittling my understanding of such. Yes, I'm a contractor, and yes, I'm familiar with contracting. But the knowledge of contracting, my experience in the world, and my conversations with people does nothing but help in this conversation. I'm looking out for everybody's interest, but I'm also not trying to negotiate against the entity that we represent, which is the city. And that's what you're going to do if you remove this clause. You are now working against the city's best interest, the city being the constituents, the city being the structure of the government. That's what's going to happen. So I'm not coming from a blanketed businessman contractor point of view, which you almost notion that it's like, hey, you're looking out for your best interest and therefore taking advantage of everybody else. No, that's not how this works. My opinion comes from a breadth of knowledge across many different fields, and I maintain that it is foolish to take this convenience clause out of the contract. Look at any contract. Listen to Joel. Joel is a retired federal government guy. He has never seen this clause taken out. He has the best interest of everybody in mind as well. And do your homework. Look up case law. Look up contract law. I would be shocked if you found one that somebody has taken this clause out of that contract. So you need to understand that I'm coming from a better place than what you just represented.
Augustus, I have a question. When we give a grant to another entity for another reason, be it a facade improvement, or I know we give some grants to other nonprofits, Women's Crisis Center and things like that. Is there an expectation of including something like this in that kind of grant?
I'm not sure that there is, but I think that the provision of services that's outlined in this contract, the duration of those, at least the minimum duration of the provision of those services, and the amount of money involved might tie into why a provision like this is necessary. For agreements like that, they're typically very short in duration. There's a distinct beginning and a distinct end. With this contract, there isn't necessarily a distinct end. It's more of an open-ended end because it's a minimum of 6 years that All Care is required to run an urban campground. So I would draw that distinction between your examples and this particular contract. And again, it's not a matter of, it's really just trying to cover the city's bases going forward, where I'm trying to look into a crystal ball and try to capture anything that could go wrong or anything that might come up where the city might decide it's not working out and the city wants an out.
But if it weren't working out, would 14, default for cause, termination for cause come into play?
Well, no, not necessarily, because the point of a termination for convenience is to terminate at any time for any reason. And so, again, that's terminate at any time for any reason, yes, but it has to have a modicum of good faith, right? It can't be at the outset of the agreement, can't be before the agreement's allowed to run its course partially. It's not something that, and again, it's expensive to terminate for convenience. It's not typically something that an organization is going to want to do unless there's a circumstances that arises. In this context, it would be where the public interest may trump the contractual obligations. It's hard for me to get into everything that could happen, but it's really just meant as a release valve for the organization if for some reason down the line it's something that the organization wants to get out of.
Rob?
So if the city at some future date wanted to terminate for convenience and all care felt it unreasonable, we know from different court battles we're in now that it can take many, many years sometimes.
Right.
But my question would be, would legal fees be the type of thing that all care would be able to recover if the city, if a court were to decide against the city's attempt at this convenience, or would this be an expense for all care? Would they be able to recoup their expenses in fighting it?
So it really would depend on what, I mean, if you're going to litigation for, I guess it would be, I can't even, I'm having trouble thinking about what it would be for. It would probably be for fraud. They would be asserting that the city is entered the contract initially in bad faith and they plan to terminate for convenience. That would be kind of what they look at. But yes, legal fees are always on the table for things like that.
Valerie, then Kurt, then Brian, then Joel.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to Rob's argument saying that, looking out for the city, he came to a totally different conclusion than I would, based on the fact that we are on this dais representing all of the people. I would come away thinking that this would be a protection to the people and the majority of people in Grants Pass. So I would tend to say, and in having gone through several lawsuits in the last several years, that yeah, it is very expensive, and yes, if you just do it out of bad faith or you just do it, you are going to pay their costs as well. I think this is just one of those things that says, look in the glass ball, you don't have any idea what may happen to throw things off, but there needs to be some sort of protection that if something egregious happens, there is a way out. And so I would tend to be in favor of it, because I do know that just because you vote in a new group of people who wants it out, that would not really rise to the occasion of being willing to get away with it without there being a legal battle and a legal fight. So I'm going to go based upon what Joel said. Probably every government contract has this in it. I think we're all just trying to second guess it and wanting to control everything, and there's some things we don't control, and that's why the clause is there in the first place.
And if I could just add, so something you said there, Counselor, you said if something egregious happens, I would like to really draw the distinction between the termination of a contract and the breach of a contract. They're not one and the same. The termination of a contract is typically spelled out in a contract, how the respective rights of the parties, what would happen upon termination. A breach is a violation of the contract. A termination is not a violation. It is just winding the contract down. So in terms of something egregious happening, whatever's egregious is spelled out in the material breach portion. I want to emphasize that this termination for convenience would be a termination at any time for any reason. Now, just because it says it's at any time for any reason doesn't necessarily mean that a court's going to look at the four corners of the contract and say, yeah, that's okay. There are a lot of factors that are going to be taken into consideration. primarily is whether the parties entered into the contract initially in good faith with the intent of adhering to the terms of the contract. That's the primary question.
Kurt?
All right, speaking from my own experience, I would concur with what Joel said, that this is in nearly every government contract I've ever been involved in, and every corporation-to-corporation contract I've been involved in. And it's usually there just to protect the biggest entity between the two in the contract. And so I've tried to argue it away, never was successful at doing that even once. I did have a contract once with Chevron down in Louisiana, and Chevron not noted as a really humanitarian company, but then came Katrina, and they didn't exercise that clause to cancel my contract. So it's always been there, and I've never had anybody exercise it. So I'm good with it in there. I understand the concerns about future cancels, but I think that Augustus, as our lawyer, is providing us to protect our rights, and I acknowledge that, and I don't see a reason to give it away.
Brian?
So we have termination by mutual consent that's in there. We have termination by breach of contract that's in there. I would argue that termination for convenience, having a clause, is not in the best interest of the city, because if a future council does decide to exercise that, it's going to cost the city a lot of money. So there's an argument to be made that it is not financially responsible for us to include that because of what a future council might do, regardless of the cost, just based on what they want to happen. They could railroad the termination for cause, regardless of how much it's going to cost the city. They might not care that we get in a lawsuit. They just want that urban campground to go away. So I don't think it's responsible for us to put that in there, because it could really hurt the city down the road to have that in there. And also, I think we've talked about it quite a bit. I was kind of curious what All Care had to say about their opinion about the clause.
Doug?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can represent everybody on the board of All Care. This is not an issue we talked about. Just Jed and I and Sam talked about this when we first had our discussions with Augustus and Aaron. We would prefer not having it there. It seems too easy for future political whims of future councils to decide they don't want the urban campground and to find a way of closing it down. So we'd rather not have it. If a middle ground could be something, I think Augustus touched on the point, for emergency purposes or something like that. Seems like a good middle ground for this one. But termination for convenience seems whether it's in federal government contracts or not, I don't know, but it seems a little too easy for you all or future councils to back out of this. And it's certainly the only contract I'm familiar with in the last 10 years has been landlord-tenant law, and that's not allowed in landlord-tenant law at all. So, whatever that's worth.
And I think that's, I mean, if council wants to go with a middle ground would be to restrict when a termination for convenience can take place. So currently, the urban campground is required to be run for a minimum of 6 years. Council can decide to put a time period by which a termination for convenience may occur. So an example I put in the PowerPoint is 3 years. So that gives All Care time to purchase the property, develop it, and at least get it filled. And so if that 3-year provision is passed, and then after 3 years, the city can terminate for convenience, that's one option. Another option is essentially a buyout of the contract. If the city wants to terminate for convenience, we can negotiate a figure that represents a buyout figure for All Care to terminate the agreement. So there are alternatives. So it's just up to council.
Did you still have something, Joel?
Yeah, I do. We need to move past a divided community where there's people that are opposed and people that are for, and we need to come together and support each other and act in that mode. And as we do that, we act reasonably and not act on our worst fears that would have those worst fears come true. That's a bunch of words. In terms of the contract, the middle ground to me is not do it for 6 years, have it in there not for 6 years. The first 6 years, the probability of something happening that would require us to look at the use of that ground for an even better public interest. At some point in time, I don't know what that would be. The city's growing, things happen. But for the first 6 years, in terms of good faith for all care, given what you're going to do for the community, that seems reasonable. Beyond that, we can account for some uncertainty that could occur that you and I don't know about. If the council changes and those worst fears of people come to pass, all care is going to be fine. And money-wise and things like that. On the other hand, my hope is that the urban campground is successful. People support it, and it is a valid tool as we move forward in managing our city. And as we do that, and you prove that, you succeed in our best outcomes. Those worst outcomes become irrelevant.
DJ?
Yeah, well said, Joel. I've heard the arguments in opposition of this clause, and it's just, I don't agree with it. I'm a proponent of keeping this clause in here. My interest is slightly piqued by Augustus's enlightening us that, okay, we can put restrictions around our restrictions. A stay on a termination for convenience. I mean, I'm just going to be honest, it just seems silly. I think that saying, oh, a council could come in the future and terminate this whole deal is fear-mongering and nothing less to achieve a goal that has nothing to do with that. You know what? Our community could burn down tomorrow. Are you going to blame us for not giving the police more money? No. So we should keep it in there, but I do have a question for you, Augustus. I would like to know your perceived merit of putting a stay on a termination for convenience so that we can compromise and finally move on. And have you ever seen this kind of adjustment to said termination?
So the merit for putting a stay would primarily be to allow the contract as agreed to be carried out. So at least the idea of doing it halfway between the minimum 6 years that all care is required to run an urban campground, that 3 years would ostensibly give all care time to obtain the property, to build out the property with any infrastructure or fixtures that they may need, and to have the property be used as an urban campground. So that would basically that time period would give all care the time that they need to get everything up and running, and would also ostensibly give the council an opportunity to see how the operation is working initially. Now, it doesn't have to be that 3 years. To answer your second question, Councillor, I'm not aware of restrictions put on clauses like this. I think the only reason that I would have brought it up as a suggestion is, again, because of the nature of this agreement and the motivation of both parties to get something done. And when I was kind of thinking through the options of how to make this more palatable possibly for council, I was taking into consideration the motivation of the parties to get a deal done. So I felt that putting a restriction on that termination for convenience might reduce Allcare's reluctance to see this particular provision in the contract.
Well said, thank you.
Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Augustus. I appreciate that. I have something to say, but I want to get a clarification from Joel first. So, Joel, were you suggesting just now that the termination for convenience potentially the stay on that would be lifted after the 6 years, or did I understand what you were saying?
Yes, and the reason I said that was because the farther out you go, the more uncertainty you have. We need to make a good faith effort on the part of everybody to make this succeed. And we will never, I would hope that our town is fairly intact, that in the public interest, we will never have to exercise it.
Thanks, I appreciate it. That's what I thought I heard you say. And that actually sounds pretty reasonable to me. I just wanted to address one thing that DJ had said. You know, he essentially said that anything, I guess, other than that would be something to do with, you know, would be instigating fear-mongering and so forth. And I really have a hard time listening to those words for this reason. If we go back to, I guess, Aaron Heisel's advice to the prior council, I mean, and we followed that advice, we would be frozen in fear. We would not even be here where we are today. We'd be doing nothing for the homeless, because in his words, everything we did would be playing right into the homeless playbook. That's a quote. So he was really trying to terrify, whether it's rightly or wrongly, and he may be a very wise person, but the prior council was frozen in fear to do anything at all for the homeless by those meetings. And I was at least one of those meetings. And everybody who was at those meetings knows what I'm saying is true. So there was a lot of those types of issues in many different directions. I think we've moved beyond that, fortunately, and now we're trying to come up with a constructive solution. And I think I probably agree with Joel's perspective that 6 years is reasonable. And at that point, I would probably be willing to agree to have the termination for convenience clause in there. And I could be, you know, outvoted on either one of those issues in either direction, but I feel that that's a balanced, reasonably balanced approach.
All right, so there's been a suggestion to have the termination for convenience clause not apply for the first 6 years, and sounds like Rob and Joel are supportive of that. What about the rest of you? Kurt?
Well, I'm okay with a time limit. For the very purpose of keeping it in the just in case category, I would be more comfortable with 3 or 4 years than 6 years. I mean, obviously, we're entering into the contract for 6 years, and we want 6 years of value to come out of it, but yeah, we have an earthquake and everything changes. 3 or 4 years seems more reasonable to me.
Brian?
I was okay with 6 years. I mean, what happens if we have an earthquake next year? You know, I mean, you can make up all sorts of scenarios for this.
We'll all be homeless and we'll all go.
Right, and no one will probably care about this contract anyway. So, you know, the grant agreement is structured for 6 years, and I would be okay, I think, with it going into effect after that 6 years.
Valerie?
Well, I still want it in there, and I guess it's because it's kind of like a little incidental thing. I think we're making too big a deal about. I mean, I think the fear-mongering is, you're right. I remember the fear-mongering from Aaron, and I agree, it was there. But I also get the fear-mongering, well, what if this next council, well, that's what electrical representative is, you know, if there's that many people that are opposed to it, and you get that many people that voted in, then that's the voice of the people. So I hesitate, you know, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I think I'd rather go with a monetary means by which there was a financial disadvantage to where they had to really think beyond that. So I'm just going to stick with my keeping it in there and let the rest of you make that decision, because like I said, I mean, the whole idea is we don't know what could happen. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen in 6 years, it could happen anytime. We don't know, and I think you're right. Fear-mongering is wrong no matter where you go with it, but at the same time, it's basically a safety clause, and it's very seldom used, and so I think we're making too big, we're using fear to drive us away from it, and I think it's there for a purpose.
Rick?
Hearing what Joel and Valerie said, I would be supportive of keeping the clause. Thank you.
And not doing a 6-year, just keeping it?
I guess I could be, as Kurt says, favor of 3 years, but I think 6 years is too long.
Okay. DJ?
Keep the clause as it is.
All right. We're just split. I got 3 people in favor of keeping it how it is, 3 people in favor of 6 years, and 1 on 3 to 4. And Vanessa's missing.
I think for the sake of compromise, I can go to 3 years. You know, if it sounds like we're split in 6 and 0, let's all meet at 3 and be happy, move on.
I would go for 3 to compromise.
Okay. Looks like now we've got some agreement on 3 years. Brian?
I'm not in favor of the 3 years, and also Councilor Auger sent us all an email this morning with her comments about this presentation, and on this particular line, she said that she was against keeping this clause in there.
Well, I think for now, it sounds like we need to make a provision for 3 years. And obviously, we're discussing the whole contract again, so it's not a done deal.
Okay.
I think this one, it kind of hits the nail on the head where we've always been a little bit divided, I think, about whether we're giving this money to the All Care Foundation or whether we're purchasing property. And this one kind of, is the rub basically on whether we have, what rights do we have in the future to control the property or the money. So we're going to have to settle
Okay,
that.
I'm forced to come into.
Hey, DJ.
Point of order.
DJ, I didn't call on you.
No.
DJ.
Point of order, DJ. DJ, point of order.
DJ, you do not have the right to speak right now. I did not call on you and you interrupted me.
What you said was factually incorrect.
Well, you can wait until I call on you and you can make a counter argument, but you do not have the right to interrupt me and speak over me.
What you said was factually incorrect.
Okay, we're moving on. Augustus, what's the next item?
Okay, my hand's in the air, Sarah.
DJ, you do not have the right to speak. We are moving on.
Nope, okay, well, I'm gonna speak anyway. So what you said was factually incorrect.
Karen, will you turn it off? Can we cut him off?
No, so that.
DJ, you can come down here and speak. Come down here.
We have all been unified on doing this. And this contract clause has zero to do with whether we support it or not. And to say that we were divided in the first place is not correct. We've all been unified in doing this. So I just want to clarify that.
Augustus, can we move on to the next item?
Yeah, so and there was a previous provision, 14.1, which stated termination provision that one of the parties could terminate if funding was not received at a certain level. That has been removed.
You know what? I'm sorry. Let's just take a recess for 10 minutes. again, and I believe we're on item, we're in 14.
Yes, so paragraph 14, the new paragraph 14.1, actually let me go back just for clarity of the record. The prior paragraph 14.1 was a termination and default for clause provision that stated that if funding was not continued at the levels necessary for the services to be provided, then that the agreement would be terminated. So kind of, it wasn't necessary, so that was removed from the contract. The new 14.1 states that changes in federal or state law regulations abrogate or disallow procurement of grantee services under this agreement. So that basically says if there's a change in state or federal law that hinders All Care's ability to provide the services that we contract for, that the contract itself would terminate. There was a suggestion from one of the counselors to attempt to alleviate this particular provision by rolling it into a shortening of the period to sell the property down the line and then roll the proceeds into affordable housing. Now that's an option, and if that's something that council wants to explore, I would probably advise moving this particular provision from 14.1 to take it out of the sphere of termination and put it into paragraph 11, which talks about the sale of property. And you can make it so that if there's a change in law, that the period for selling the property would be shortened from 6 years with the consent of council. So that's the discussion point. And so I want to turn it over to council for that.
Questions, comments? I'm not sure I understood the whole crux, I guess, of what 14.1 means.
Okay, so 14.1 says that the agreement will terminate if we provide, if for some reason there's a change in federal or state law that hinders All Care's abilities to perform under the contract. So say that there's a law that comes into effect that says an urban campground isn't allowed in a particular zone anymore. Say that, and I'm just kind of spitballing, it's hard for me to kind of foresee this, but this is typically a standard provision. A change in law happens that prevents All Care from making subcontracts of certain types, right? That makes it impractical for them to follow through with the agreement as signed and as executed. Basically, what this will do is this will activate the termination provision, and then the rights of the respective rights of the parties in paragraph 16 and 17 will come into effect, and then the contract will terminate. There was a suggestion from a counselor that was basically saying that if there's a change in law like this, whether it's federal or state law, instead of including this as a termination provision, the suggestion was converting this clause into basically a condition that if something like this were to happen, instead of the contract terminating, what would happen is that the timeline for All Care to be able to sell the property, which is currently set at a minimum of 6 years before they can sell the property, that timeline would be moved up based on that change of law. Did that answer your question?
It helped for me. Do other people still have questions or comments on that? Is it okay as is, or are you interested in amending it, I guess, to include an ability for All Care to sell or repurpose the property?
So yeah, as it currently stands, this is a provision that would trigger termination of the agreement. And this is, again, typically something like this is a boilerplate termination provision.
It would really only apply within the next 6 years?
Or however long I mean, initially, yes.
Because after that, All Care would have the ability to sell the property, right?
Yes.
Okay. Joel?
So I'm just trying to make it work as a former contracting officer. 14, either party may terminate this agreement or modify the agreement upon mutual approval. Approval is not the right word. Mutual agreement, effective on delivery of 90 days, written notice to the party on the occurrence of any of the following. So if we wanted to modify it and both parties agreed to it, we could do that.
Yes, and that actually is covered in the amendment provision, which is in paragraph 22, which states that no amendment or modification to this agreement will be effective without prior written consent of the authorized representatives of the parties. So you could use that paragraph if you wanted to at some point in the future to modify terms of the contract with mutual consent.
So from what I hear you telling me, then we already have that flexibility, and that can trump what we would do here with automatic termination.
That's correct, because I mean, you have the contract in practice, right? The four corners of the documents, and then you have reality where the parties are so involved in wanting the parties want the contract to stay intact until they don't, right? So realistically, conversations would take place with All Care personnel about something like that. The circumstances in which it would be like, oh, we're not going to discuss it, we're not going to have a conversation, are very low.
Okay, so what I hear you saying then, and let me ask you the question directly, that we already have the flexibility to modify the contract if this happens, rather than terminate it if it's in the interest of both parties.
That is correct.
I'm fine.
Okay, sounds like we have some flexibility there.
Okay. Are there any other questions about this particular provision? Okay. So the last provision before we go back to the restrictive covenant is paragraph 17, and these are remedies for All Care upon termination of the contract. So as I kind of discussed before, termination is meant to be predictable. It's meant so that the parties know exactly what's going to happen upon termination of the contract, not breach, but termination. So currently, if this agreement is terminated for any reason other than a material breach by All Care, the city is required to reimburse All Care for all reasonable expenses actually incurred by or charged to the grantee attributable to termination, including but not limited to the reasonable termination or demobilization charges or expenses actually charged to grantee by its subcontractors, and the appraised costs of any capital improvements upon the real property by grantee. And then after all of that is said and done, after the date of termination, All Care no longer has any responsibilities under the contract. So this is what All Care would get if the contract itself were terminated. So I wanted to bring this particular paragraph before council to see if there were any additions or if there's any modifications that you would want to make to this paragraph as it relates to the rights of All Care upon termination.
Questions? I guess people are okay with it as is for now.
Okay, so for right now, I'll leave that as is. So, kind of going back to 8.1, I've provided council with a draft, a very, very rough draft of the restrictive covenant and option to purchase. So what this instrument would do, the purpose of this instrument would be to make it clearly known that the property that All Care purchases is to be used for an urban campground for a minimum of 6 years. So I don't know if you've had an opportunity to go over it. I did send it, I believe it was sent out in the packet last week, but it's a very simple instrument. It would be executed by both parties, and then it would be recorded with the clerk. And so essentially it just states that the property can't be used for any other purpose other than affordable housing. I think it's just for affordable housing, not just an urban campground. It does state that an urban campground needs to be run for a minimum of 6 years. So it's also ties into 8.2, where if after the 6 years, All Care decides to sell the property to a third party, that if the third party intended to use the property for a purpose other than affordable housing, then as part of the purchase, the city would basically erase the restrictive covenant. We would record another document that says this restrictive covenant is extinguished and the property that's been sold to a third party may use the property in a way that they see fit, because the money that All Care would be receiving ostensibly from a sale of property would be what is now going to be reinvested into affordable housing. So this is a rough draft. I just wanted to see if any counselors have any questions about it.
Joel?
So I just need to make sure I understand. Contracting can get fairly complex with the different provisions. So the intent is if All Care sells the property, then they're required to buy an additional property with a covenant. And the property that they sold, then that covenant can be released to the purchaser if the new property has the covenant. So
restrictive covenants typically follow land. So in this case, All Care would be purchasing a piece of property for an urban campground. The restrictive covenant would state that the property that All Care purchases is for affordable housing. And it references the contract that we're entering into. It references all of the definitions. And urban campground is included under affordable housing. And then say that after 6 years, everything's run swimmingly well. All Care has identified a good opportunity for affordable housing investment in the city. All Care can then sell the property to a third party. Now, whether or not the restrictive covenant is released is up to that third party. If that third party wants to use the property for affordable housing, then the city doesn't have to release the restrictive covenant if the city doesn't want to.
Okay.
However, if the third party wants to use it for something else, anything else, and that restrictive covenant is still with that property, so the city would need to extinguish that restrictive covenant. And then if All Care bought another piece of property, and that's also addressed in this contract, if All Care bought another piece of property, then we would enter into a similar restrictive covenant and option to purchase.
Great. Okay, I'm okay.
Any other questions? Nope. Okay.
Okay, and I think there might have been one more thing because 10.1 and paragraph 12. So I just wanted to, since we're putting a placeholder for paragraph 12 for 3 years before the city can execute a termination for convenience, I'm not going to be making any changes to paragraph 10.1, which reads, city or grantee terminate this agreement or upon mutual termination. All right, thank you, council.
All right, any more discussion about that? Are we going to go over the covenant?
I'd be happy to go over it with you, yes.
Sorry, you thought you were off the hook there.
No, don't worry about it.
All right, everybody, we have a separate paper, just a one sheet labeled Exhibit A, Restrictive Covenant, if you want to just take a moment to look that over and see if you have any questions. Joel?
So I had just a quick question. Let's say we're in year 7. And Allcare wouldn't do this, but if they wanted to, could they remove the covenant in year 7 while they're still operating it as an urban campground?
No.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions today? We will address this again. I think we need to look at some zone buffers, maps. All right, we're getting close though.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, our next topic is community pool.
All right, good afternoon. Before I get going, you'll see there's a new name on the slide, Josh Hopkins. He is our new park superintendent, and he is here to my right. So I just want to introduce Josh to you, a long time in coming. And we're very excited to have him on community development team. And so what do we start in week 3 already? So we're going to split up the presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background, and then he's going to go into some of the more technical elements of the presentation today. So our objective is to continue the discussion about the pool. We had talked about this about 5-6 weeks ago, and we presented kind of an overall outline that shows sort of refining, to a greater detail what kind of amenities we want for the pool, so that we can put together a higher quality request for proposals. So that's really what we're here to do, talk about some more details on amenities, construction materials in the process, and we have a couple of items there, how it relates to community goals, council goals. So just a quick reminder, we are talking specifically about the city-owned 0.9 acre parcel adjacent to the school, but both to the north and to the east is a school district-owned property. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those. Here's the timeline we presented to you at your last workshop. In particular, this first row, project scoping and refinement, we had a 3 to 5 month time frame on that, and I think council just had to express some interest in being more engaged with what goes into that scope. So our goal today is to really get a little bit more detail from the council on what you'd like to see on that, expecting that we may meet again as we come back with more details for you. The one thing we did not talk about last meeting in terms of the school district property, we focused really on the parcel to the north, which is just about an acre. It also has the existing parking lot on it. So there's that piece, but then there's also the vacant, much smaller property that's adjacent and has been historically used, there during the swim season, but that is not city-owned property. So we wanted to sort of put that before the council as well. Josh and I did hold a meeting since your last workshop with the school district. They continue to be interested and express a desire to cooperate with the city and have discussions. A couple of specific things that we threw out at that meeting were, do they have any concerns if the facility itself, either the pool or the restrooms, locker rooms encroached at all, onto a property. That didn't seem to be completely out of the question for them. We also talked quite a bit about, the pros and cons of the parking lot. And if you expand the parking lot, of course, for the city's purposes, how does that benefit us? Well, it certainly benefits. We don't have any parking off-street really today other than what's on the school property. So that could, I think from the district standpoint, would benefit. That's really their main visitor parking for the school district. So during the school year, it would offer the school district some additional parking for visitors. But there's a lot more that can go on there. This white line that you see here is more or less that rear line of where the baseball field is at today. So some considerations will need to be given to possible buffer and what are the factors to consider in design to protect cars that are parked there, et cetera. And then cost sharing would be another sort of key discussion that we would want to engage in with the city, with the district, since it would presumably continue to be on district property and be used by the district as well as the city. So I think I highlighted most of those issues that are on this slide, talking about the benefits to both entities for the increased parking footprint, keeping that baseball field intact, having some kind of barrier between the field and the parking area. So again, I think a lot of this really, in some ways, is a little downstream from where we are today, but we just want to let you know that that's ongoing discussions. But as you're talking about, the city's potential obligations, particularly with this use requiring 42 or so parking spaces in order to meet code, and the utilization of that for the pool, which is, just going to be a couple of months a year. Sort of just having that awareness that this is ongoing discussion. So I think at this point, we'll turn it over, and so Josh can come up. We're going to start out with just some highlights of the Ashland pool plan, which I think Councilor DeLaGrange had shared with the rest of the council, so we'll give some highlights of that, and then dive into some other specifics on the recommendations. So there you go, Josh.
Good afternoon, Council. Josh Hopkins, Parks Superintendent. As Director Clark mentioned, I've been here 3 weeks today. So it was brought to our attention that, Ashland's district for their parks is looking at rebuilding their pool. We were able to get some of the information from their current project just to give you guys kind of an idea, not just some more about the overall figures that you're going to be looking at possibly down the road, but just the detail that kind of goes into these types of projects. So the next few slides are kind of referencing Ashland and talking about what Ashland's got going on. So with that, they're building a new facility at the Daniel Myers Pool. Their initial plan talks about building a 25 meter by 25 yard pool that kind of has a little dog leg that goes out there so that, they can have a shallow end that recesses from like 0 foot depth down to like 4 foot depth, which allows them to have a lot more usage of that area. Their design itself seems to be pretty lean towards aquatic sports and those types of usage. The first 6 lanes there, they've designed it to be at a standard depth of 8 feet to accommodate like water polo, extra swim lines and stuff along those lines. With that, one thing we'll need to decide later on in this slideshow is what type of usage are we looking for? Are we looking for more of a specialized usage, more of a community usage, or are we looking for kind of a mixture of the two? Because that kind of says what type of amenities we need to plan for, which that really tells us what our overall size needs to be. As far as the example cost goes, Ashland is switching over to a Merthyr liner type product. This is a stainless steel pool wall. It's where a lot of manufacturer or a lot of other entities are switching over to, as opposed to the standardized concrete that we're all kind of used to from growing up. It provides a lot of benefits compared to concrete, and there's some negatives that go along with it too. But their overall concrete cost, they've got about $4 million total of what they're expecting between the $2 million Merthyr liner with the stainless steel walls, and then all the different excavation that goes along with that. And that does not include the updates that they need to do to their bathhouses. For the updates on the bathhouses, it comes at a high cost as well. A large part of this is due to the ADA requirements. One thing that we're working under when we're talking about updating all of our new facilities is the 2014 ADA upgrades that went into all municipal governments and everything along those lines. The Oregon Administrative Rule, Chapter 33, Division 60, which talks about on the one side of the slide, details all the requirements for an Oregon public pool as far as what you're allowed to have amenity-wise, what type of pumps you're supposed to have, all that stuff, but it also talks about ADA. And then as a part of that ADA, there's also the municipal codes that go with the standard building that they need to meet for. So with this cost, we kind of come into another $470,000 for what they're expecting. Moving down the line, they did look at 3 different heating options that are a part of these costs you'll see here. Those 3 heating options, one was just going all natural gas, and the other ones were a mixture of natural gas or electric heating options. The natural gas was found to be the most cost-effective of all of them. It's kind of the standard for heating pools. There are a lot of systems out there in place that offset natural gas to keep those costs lower. But you're talking on the low end of their cost about right over $4.7 million for the lowest end of what Ashland's planning on doing with their pool. And that even goes up to a little over 5.3 million. So that's kind of the range that they're working on, and that's if we were to build a similar size facility of Ashland. And we would probably be expecting a similar cost. We do need to make upgrades to our mechanical rooms and all that, which would be incorporated into this as well. So this is where we get into more of like what we need to know on our end to be able to start working on that RFP process and develop that scope. Is first stop is what type of usage are we looking for? Are we looking for a pool that specializes in swim teams, stuff like that, or are we looking for one that's more of like a community use with open swim? Or do we want a mixture of the 3, or a mixture of the 2? With Ashland, they're definitely on that specialized side. With our current pool, we had diving boards and things like that, which, you know, we need to know if that's what we want to do, because that'll tell us what type of depth we need, and that'll tell us kind of the rise and fall and the length of the pool. Moreover, with those pool amenities, continuing the topic, above is a modified list prioritization from the previous meeting you guys had back in April. It's modified off of the previous aquatics committee that looked at your guys' project. And the ones that we didn't list on this one that were on the original list was a lap pool and an exercise shallow end and a retractable use, or a retractable roof. With the lap pool and the exercising shallow end, knowing the other amenities kind of let us know like what depth we need to be at and what type of specialized uses you guys are looking for. And it didn't seem like at the last meeting there was much really desire to go with the retractable roof option simply because of the increase in cost and everything that would incur. So with that, it appears that, you know, the general agreement was you guys are looking for a pool that has some of these amenities like a water slide or diving boards. With that, you know, we kind of need to know what amenities you are looking to have, because that kind of tells us, again, what depths are. For instance, you can have a 10-foot diving board under the ORS we run off of if you have a 9-foot depth. You can have up to a 12-foot water slide with a 6-foot depth underneath it, and things along those natures. As far as things like a diving platform, you can have as high as up to 3 meters, so like 9.8 feet. And that all goes in the same water lines as the diving boards. And the other big thing we need to know is what additional pool features are you looking for as far as adding like a toddler pool, or if you're wanting to add the hot tub option. And then we are talking about redoing the locker rooms and restrooms and things along those lines. So if we were to add a toddler pool, are you wanting that as a separate pool itself, or is that something you'd want similar to the way Ashland's doing it, where they have that entrance that kind of recesses down from 0-foot depth to like a 4 or 5 foot depth to allow for that use for like younger kids and things like that, but not necessarily separate from the main pool itself. Other considerations, council mentioned that, you know, there's not a lot of shade at our current pool. That could be a problem for spectators, could be a problem for anyone using the pool. They do make all sorts of sunshades, and a lot of pools incorporate these into their designs. If sunshades is something council would like to add, incorporate into design, that would be something that we could look at. The other option that a lot of places have are removable bulkheads. Where I came from in Corvallis, we had an natatorium that had a 50-meter indoor pool with it that had a movable bulkhead. It allowed them to shorten the length of the pool down to 25 meters for short course and extend the length of the pool out to 50 meters for long course if they needed to. So what it allowed them to really do is, you know, you have a 50-meter pool, you're able to really help out and branch out the amount of amenities and different uses you can have at your pool. Additionally, currently our pool has a concrete bulkhead in the center of it. It's like 21 meters from the back wall. If that was a removable bulkhead, we'd be able just to move that back if needed to, type of a thing to allow for that use, but still keep that same footprint of the 120-foot long pool that we currently have. So movable bulkheads are pretty cool. Moving over to kind of construction material, this is definitely one of the bigger decisions that we need to know moving forward. You've got your standard construction of the concrete. That's what our current pool is. That's what a lot of pools since eternity of making pools have been made out of. But we've had a lot of advancements in the technologies of pool construction over the last couple decades. And now, similar to Ashland, many organizations are switching over to these stainless steel pools with a membrane. And there's a lot of benefits, especially on the cost saving overall maintenance side of those. Just a little example of some of the overall cost. We'll get a little bit more detail and pros and cons here in a second. Mirtha Liner is the company that Ashland is using for their pools. They were able to send me over a copy of a third-party analysis, basically showing overall cost of maintaining their pools. Don't let the numbers scare you. This is for 6 total pools. And with that, it just shows over a 20-year lifespan. Option 1 is with the concrete, 2 and 3 are with the Mirtha liners. The difference between option 2 and the difference between option 3 is if we were buying directly from the manufacturer in option 3, we wouldn't have the markup from buying from a contractor type of a thing. But overall, you can see that the 5 to 20-year maintenance costs for the Mirtha liners are all significantly less than what you'd encounter with the concrete pools. Mirtha is very, clear and upfront about when it comes to initial cost, theirs are more expensive by 5 to 10%, but you make up for that for the life of the facility. So pros and cons of the concrete. Again, you've got a very long life expectancy. Our current pool was built in the 50s, and even from the Pool Works report from 2019, it mentions that it's still in good condition as far as like the actual structure of the pool. There is a lower cost to initial install as compared to the stainless steel options. It's got very high durability and they're super customizable. The bad things about concrete pools is you don't get much of a warranty out of them. Once they go in, you're lucky to get a 1 to 2 year contractor warranty on them as far as leaks and everything like that. So that's a big deterrent for a lot of organizations moving forward. And then they really just do have a higher standard reoccurring maintenance cost, higher overall operating cost and chemical use. It's because of the porous nature of the concrete itself. It allows for a lot more bacteria and stuff like that to find places to hide. So you end up having to chlorinate it more, wash it off, spray it out, and everything like that on a much more frequent basis. And then they do have a longer installation timeline, ranging 3 to 6 months, depending on the size of pool and the style you're going with. With the PVC liner and the PVC membrane, pros and cons on those, some of them are similar. They do have long life expectancy, and they have a long warranty for the steel structure and the membrane itself. The steel structure comes with a 25-year warranty as kind of the industry standard, and they're expected to last well after that. Each membrane comes with about a 10-year warranty as far as leaks, tears, damage, and everything like that for the first 10 years, and they're expected to last between 12 to 15 years from the different people I've spoken to in the industry. You do have a lower overall maintenance cost simply because they're made of they have already designed antimicrobial stuff into their liners, so they're not as porous, they don't need as much chlorine, they don't need as frequently cleaned, and they really save you on overall staff time. That slide previously where it was comparing the cost between the two, part of the big cost was not having to spend as much on that. With the liner, the company Renosys, says that, they expect you to save between 15 to 20% on operating figures throughout the course of the pool. And that's quite a bit of savings when you're looking at it over the time. As far as cons go, they do come at an initial installation cost that is higher. So if budget is a long-term issue, budget is a short-term issue, that is something that needs to be considered, but you do make up for that during the life of the product. The membrane does require being replaced several times for the life of the pool. Again, it's got a 12 to 15 year life expectancy, and the colors do fade typically before the end of the warranty period, which isn't something that's covered by the warranty. So at year 8, you may be looking at kind of a faded color, but the liner is still in perfect condition to be usable, and that's not really something they normally cover. It's just more that aesthetic issue. And then they are just less durable than concrete. Again, it's not like your standard type of membrane that you get in a residential pool. It's only like 20 milliliters thick. These are like huge 60-inch thick ones. They are very sturdy, and they do have that 10-year warranty. Just as kind of an aside for cost-wise for this, you imagine you've got to repaint your pool every 5 to 7 years. You guys recently had a quote for that around $50,000. And then, you know that by the lifetime of one of these liners, that's, 2-3 times you've had to incur that cost compared to replacing these liners once. And that's just a large scale thing. And that's not even talking about resurfacing the pool itself every 15 years or so to make sure it's not slick or anything like that, because these do come with already anti-slip factors put into their design. Other considerations for this conversation is just the pool operations and seasons. Currently, the pool operates towards the middle end of June to the end of August. June 20th, I believe, is kind of our hopeful start date into like August 26th. There has been some consideration of extending the season out one way or the other or both directions. With that, we really need to talk to the YMCA, who is our contractor for the pool. We haven't had those discussions yet as far as what their capacity to staff that is. On our end, if we are extending it, we don't have the ability for staffing on our side. We don't have anyone that's designated solely to the aquatic section, and we don't have anyone that's trained as lifeguards for that. I will say there is a nationwide lifeguard shortage. It's something we've been dealing with where I just came from, and several pools have had to close and alter their thing or their general operating hours just because there's not any lifeguards out there right now. A lot of jurisdictions are actually looking at creating like full union employee lifeguards that are just full-time jobs at this point because they don't have that base anymore. And then if we did extend the season, we'd have to look at what type of impact that would have on the school district around, especially if we're sharing parking and stuff like that. If it's into the spring, they've got sports going on. If it's into the fall, they've got sports going on. Our nice little time in the summer, there's not a lot going on at the school district on those fields, so it kind of creates that big gap for us to be able to take advantage of with the parking side. And then it's one of those things, longer the season, longer the cost. Whether that's heating the pool in the shoulder seasons or increasing materials of extra chlorine and stuff like that. So if we are going to look at extending the seasons, those are just a few things to consider. And then as far as council considerations, one of the other things we can look at is rehabilitating the current pool. As it stands, the pool committee and the council have largely been focused on building a completely new facility in this location. We do have the ability to look at possibly just adding a liner to our existing pool and extending out its useful life. The Anderson Pool Works evaluation did state that the overall condition of both the competition pool and the shallow end are good. That does open up the doors for a couple of other options as well, including like a hybrid model, which I'll talk about in just a second. But for example, we could add just a PVC liner to our existing pool, extend its useful life out for at least 10 more years, if not longer. That would be a lot more cost-effective option. I was able to get a quote back, a kind of, just ballpark figure from one of the companies on what that would cost. And then we could also look at adding a PVC liner type of surfacing to the concrete decking itself, which would take away all of our trip issues, crack issues. It would make the decking waterproof itself, and then it'd be, slip resistant, have nice fall protection and things like that. The cost for relining the pool itself was about $85K, and the cost for adding the decking was about $117,000. And as a part of their assessment they did recommend that we would get a new gutter system installed that recirculates and is a lot better, and that one actually came into about $430,000. But, you know, it is one of those things, if you go back a few slides, you'll see that the Martha pool that they're talking about putting in Ashland at that 25 by 25, you know, they're looking at $2 million for basically that pool alone, whereas we do have the ability to look at the feasibility of just upgrading our current pool to a higher standard for a few $100,000, which would get us through the next 10 years at least. And that's something that really needs to take into consideration, because there has been discussion from the council on doing some variation of an actual indoor aquatic facility located at that Allen Creek Reserve property. If that's something council thinks is going to be feasible in the next 10 years or so, you know, there is merit to saying that maybe we should fix what we have now before committing to building something new that we're then going to go back out for a large sum of money later down the road. I just wanted to bring this up as an option for council to consider. There just wasn't a lot of, you know, look at actually just seeing what we could do to rehabilitate it. With this option, we do also have the ability to do some variation of a hybrid model. You know, we could look to add a few other features to the pool that aren't currently there. We could look into the feasibility of having the current bulkhead removed and then adding a movable bulkhead. The cost on one of those was estimated to be about $75,000, but that would allow for you guys to move the bulkhead back to that 25 meters so that the swim team has that as a practice spot if they wanted to do that. Again, we'd be able to put the diving boards back in towards the deep end and look at slide options and things like that down the road too, because on those removable bulkheads, you could put the blocks and stuff on the bulkhead itself, so you wouldn't have to remove anything on the back end. And then the other style of hybrid option that they do, some of the companies like Murtha, they do it to where they will come and assess your current pool facility, see the concrete viability, and they can add their inner walls to that concrete and then extend out your pool one way or the other if you needed to by just excavating out one wall. And so there's a savings to that side of it as well. You know, that's if you wanted to go that full route. Again, I think the bigger question is, where do you guys see aquatics in the next 10 years, 15 years in the city of Grants Pass? If you're really wanting to move towards that indoor facility that's going to be $15, $20 million and likely a bond project, what is the appetite for the citizens spending $5 million or more now fixing an outdoor pool type of a thing compared to what you're going to run into? So with that, just some more council clarifications. We really just kind of need some comments on what you guys think about the current timelines. The expansion agreement with the school district, that's one that, you know, we definitely need to know about, especially if we're looking at redoing the entire pool, so we know what type of parameters we can give for shifting things over and stuff along those lines. What type of usage are you looking for? Specialty usage, similar to Ashland's, keeping that 8-foot depth, or are you wanting diving boards and more community usage features? Or do you want kind of a design that has both with like the removable bulkhead for the swim team? Then just the general amenities you're wanting. Are you wanting a separate small kiddie pool? Are you wanting a hot tub? Those types of things. Or are you wanting to incorporate, if we're doing a new design, adding that similar to the way Ashland did it with that cool entranceway that they've got going. Then, you know, construction materials, pros and cons, concrete, stainless steel. As far as my side staff recommendation, due to the decrease in overall maintenance cost and then just the long-term viability of those, we kind of lean towards the stainless steel with the membrane, similar to other places. Ben just had one stuck in. In the city of Corvallis, we had a new Martha liner stuck in our outdoor pool, and a large part of that was so that we could have that decrease in chlorine usage and everything like that, that, you know, our public really appreciated. And then, you know, really comes down to, are we doing new construction for the whole thing? Do you want to know more about rehabilitation options? Or would you rather be into more of like a hybrid model where we're looking at, you know, kind of using similar footprint of what we have now, but maybe just extending it out to meet the needs that we currently have? And then, you know, we do have the call to action screen, which says council discretion, and then there are a few alternatives right now. Staff can you could direct us to get a formal RFP getting going right now based off of your guys' input. We can continue the topic to another workshop if there's more information about one of these things you guys are interested in knowing more details about. And then, you know, we could invite representatives from Medford, Ashland, or other public jurisdictions to see kind of what they learned as they were going through their pool processes. And then there's always the no action option. So with that, questions, discussion? see what goes.
All right, thanks, Josh. Nice job for your first presentation 3 weeks in, huh?
Thank you.
Looks like we have some questions. Do you have one, Val?
Well, I wanted a little bit more explanation, because you gave us a lot of information very quickly. A nice job and welcome. About the bulkhead, you know, you kind of rattle through that really fast, and I just was trying to keep up with the language of exactly what that meant. So and because this is the first time we talked about a hybrid or that sort of thing, I
Yeah.
expand upon that a little bit.
Okay, I'll just go back to that slide. So they make movable bulkheads. They're actually really cool when you're looking at having a pool that has a large usage that you're wanting. You know, you want a deep end for diving boards and things like that, but you also want swim team practicing there. So instead of making a pool that's like 25 meters long and they're swimming this way, you can put a movable bulkhead in there to separate out those usages. And there's a couple of different companies that make these. The idea is whether it's on a wheel or a mechanical track, there's a track system, and when you need to go back 10 yards one way or the other, you just press the button, it moves out of the way, or it moves back and forth.
Okay.
What's nice about it for like the city of Corvallis with their indoor natatorium pool is they can have swim team practicing on one side of the pool and still have their exercise classes on the other, because the two what would normally be conflicting usage isn't a conflict, that bulkhead separating the two in between. Our current bulkhead at the pool is like 21 meters or so from the back wall there. It's a concrete one. It looks like it was put in after the main pool itself was designed, so it doesn't provide that type of flexibility. So if we're looking at upgrading the pool in one way or the other, putting a movable bulkhead in there, whether it's a new design or not, just kind of helps make it more usable and more user-friendly.
Okay. And you talked at the end when you were talking about the hybrid and having the membrane part of it, you brought that up again. I don't know exactly in what context. I guess I can see where the bulkhead could go easily and slide on that particular structure. So you talked about them being able to expand our concrete pool. Anyway, I was a little bit more information on that.
So the concrete pool here is ours in this
Right.
picture. Mm-hmm. With that, they have the ability to, and let's see, orientation wise, here's the shallow end. Over here, we've got the concrete bulkhead. It's about 10 feet wide. They have the ability to anchor these steel membrane panels into our current concrete structure and then expand out where they're not going to anchor them. So what it allows you to do is save like the base of your pool, a couple side walls, and then you're only paying for the excavation cost of, 10, 20 yards one way or the other type of a thing. So you're able to reuse a lot of that current infrastructure of your pool. If we were to do that route, we could look into the feasibility of having this bulkhead itself removed and then adding a removable bulkhead or movable bulkhead to that. Or the flip side of that would be on the other side where the deep end is, we could look at extending that out another 10 meters or so to get that 25 meter, or I think it only has to go like 5, to get that 25 meter depth. And that's when they'd come in and on that back wall, they would create this whole system for this interlocking stainless steel paneling. So the idea is it just allows another hybrid to where it's not necessarily ripping the entire pool itself out and then having to backfill and do a bunch of work. You can use the existing footprint. That option we'd need to look at to make sure that if we were going to do that, our current piping and everything like that was going to be available to be used and make it still efficient and everything.
Okay. And so you would need to have those people come out and do
Yeah,
an
like
analysis.
if that's the direction the council wanted to go, then that's what we'd start running up with those contractors, is to see what we could do to get some more formalized idea on if it's viable or not.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have something, Rick? Rick?
Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate you presenting some alternatives, and I'm really interested in the rehabilitation and hybrid model in the future. But one question I do have, I know in a lot of private pools, they use solar heating. Was that looked into at all, and what would the cost be in return, or is it a viable thing, or is natural gas really the only way?
So I didn't look into the heating style of the pool partially to much detail, just because we need to kind of have more of an idea of what council's wanting to do. If we're looking to build an all-new facility, there are rules on the state as far as what level of green energy technologies we're required to use. A lot of new buildings, I think it was like Ashland's being required that 1.5% of their total project cost has to go towards that. With that, we do have the solar thermal option. Some places are using those. There's always the standard solar panel options to help offset heating. Natural gas is traditionally going to be the cheapest, most cost-effective way to continuously heat a pool, but we can look to offset it. For Ashland's example, when they were doing it, they had 3 cost alternatives, basically natural gas, then like installing 4 electric heat pumps, and then option that kind of hybrided the 2 for electric heat pumps during the summer months and then during the winter months, because they're looking for a year-round operation using the natural gas to backfill that. Their assessment came back basically just saying that the natural gas was the most cost-effective, but not necessarily one they overall recommend. It really comes down to what like community values are, type of a thing. Not geothermal, that would be sweet, but the solar thermal options, those are used in a lot of municipal pools too. They are a pretty cool system. You've got your little solar array up top, water gets pumped down through a filter, pumped back up, and it circulates out like that, heats up in the array, comes down, and it allows for a lot of like continuity of keeping that general heat that you're wanting. And those can decrease cost over time. They are expensive systems, and as far as the feasibility of them go, it really depends on the size of the pool, the surface area of the pool, and what type of space we have to work with. One of the limiting factors you run into those is, like with all solar, you've got to have the right type of engineered roof to be able to put them up there. And then with surface area, some of the stuff that I was reading from energy.gov was saying that, you know, to heat a pool properly, depending on the region, you need at least 50 to 100% of the pool's actual water surface area. And so if we're looking for a summertime only use, you know, maybe we'd be in that lower end because it's normally hot. If we're looking into more of a winter use like what Ashland's talking about, then we need a much larger surface area. So without really knowing to what level we're going to be rebuilding the rest of the facilities to, it's hard to really judge. But as a part of our whole process, we'd be evaluating that along the way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions, Kurt?
I just wanted to ask on the the movable bulkhead, is that strictly a partition at the surface level?
They go down a certain level and then they'll like kind of a rise type of a thing. They've got like a little bit, because a lot of them are designed on that slant, you know, so they're designed to kind of rise with the slope of your pool.
Thanks.
Yep.
Other questions? Rob?
Yeah, thanks. A few questions. So, could someone tell me exactly when the swim team season is in Grants Pass? Does anyone know? Winter. So our swim team would not be using this pool unless we had essentially a 4-season pool. Is that right?
For the high school swim teams.
Right. Okay.
Is there still a summer swim? I think there's a summer team too. So the high school competitive teams are during the school year, and then there's a summer swim team.
So the Ashland pool is designed for a swim team to be able to practice?
Yeah, they've got it lined out for them to do the practice and everything like that.
So is that the pool that goes down to like a 0 depth for toddlers? And they have a movable bulkhead, or how do they do that?
They didn't have a removable bulkhead. If we were to go back, I can show you that they just designed their pool, like I said, 25 meters by 25 yards, and they lined it out like that. So one length of their pool is exactly at that 25 meters for the short course, and the other one's just a little bit less than that at 25 yards. And then when we're looking at it, this area right here is where the depth goes from, I'm not sure how deep it is on this end, but it gradually comes out to 0. The idea that they had listed for that is it allowed for more of the aerobic style therapy stuff in that shallower end. It provides a nice spot for like a young kid to like wade around in. I think I'd be a little concerned about, you know, having to watch that.
And I don't know if I heard in your presentation, is there an appreciable difference as far as heat loss goes between the concrete pools versus the stainless steel lined pools?
From what I've found, it looks like it takes more to heat a concrete pool as opposed to the stainless steel pool with the liner. But but I wasn't able to get like an affirmative, oh, you're expecting like an X amount more type of thing. It's just the general consensus is it is more.
And how long has the Mirtha product been manufactured?
Mirtha's been manufactured for 60 years. They're based out of Italy.
The current product, is it 60 years?
60 years, and the other company I've looked at, Rennis, has been 35 years, and there's a few more in that kind of general time frame. And yeah, they're one industries are going to. Mirtha's the one that, you know, a lot of times gets like the Olympic contracts to build site pools and stuff like that.
Okay. I also just want to point out, if I remember correctly, when Josh started out, he mentioned that a possible aquatic facility throughout the term, the figures of 15 to 20 million. I know when Matt was here a couple months ago, if I'm not mistaken, those figures were 25 to 40 million is the figures that we were thrown out. So just to be accurate when we're making a decision, yeah.
Yeah, the figures I used were based off of that Anderson Pool Works report. That's what he put in there for an indoor facility.
Okay, thank you.
Brian.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to meet you. Not all of our meetings are this exciting. I thought last time we talked about the pool, we gave direction for staff to draft up an RFP already. So I'm kind of confused why we're having another presentation when council has already given direction to draft an RFP.
So we were unable to draft an accurate RFP based on the information that we had today. You know, if we would have put out an RFP with the information that we had discussed, you know, as of about 4 weeks ago, we would be getting so many questions from the consulting community that it would have been pointless. So, I mean, that's really what we're trying to hone in on, you know, the actual content of the RFP so that we can get more high quality bids.
So it's not the job of the consultant to help us figure out these details. It's our job before we hire the consultant.
It's a fine line, really. We can put something out to say, consultant, come and, you know, help facilitate, you know, a discussion to get to these amenities. But I guess our assumption was that the council, you know, was maybe going to want to provide some more input on that.
Okay.
And some of the more baser stuff, like what council's interested in as far as building materials, what type of pool usage you're looking for, those are types of things the consultant would really need to know in order to be able to start drafting that type of stuff.
Is it, at this point, are we looking at a consultant, an RFP for somebody who would help just design the pool, but it's not to the contracting stage, so they could provide more accurate cost estimates for us of both options if we were interested? Or is it, I don't know what's reasonable to ask, you know, do we need to, how much do we need to narrow it down for the scope on the RFP?
Yeah, we are working towards the two-phase RFP. So yeah, the first one would be a designer, and then a second round would be for the actual construction. So on the design side, I think as Josh was mentioning, and correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but I think the, you know, the liner, the materials, whether you want to see that pool used more on the, you know, the swim team competitive side, like what Ashland's doing, or go more on the recreational with the diving board, this, you know, the slide, things like that. I think those were two of the really critical factors before we would be able to get, you know, a designer to take a look at it.
Okay. Yeah. I didn't personally really appreciate that the grassy hill between the pool and the tennis court belongs to the district rather than to the city. So that makes a significant difference, I guess, in terms of what kind of space we have to work with. I guess to me it seems like that might even be a natural starting point, is to see whether they would be open to us. It sounds like they're not totally opposed to us building partly on that space, but you know, purchasing it, or some sort of agreement that they are going to share the space. before we get too far down this road. And I was going to ask, Joel has to leave in a moment, but so you were part of the pool task force. How far did that process get into outlining what sort of features are needed by the community?
So I think they were looking at a combination. And they favored, of course, they didn't have the information that you presented today on the modification of the existing pool, but they favored construction of a new pool. And then there was a two-phase thing where they would then either collaborate with a third party or depending on what the city wanted to do, go it alone, which is a little more expensive. About 20 years from now, put it on the Parks Master Plan, the Aquatic Center. I'm going to have to leave here fairly soon, so I got another meeting I need to go to, and I just wanted to give my 2 cents worth. I like the combined use, and then in terms of whether the other decision point I think that we probably need to make today in terms of the RFP is, do we want to modify the existing pool for 10 years at a cost of $500,000, probably, I don't know, up to $1 million. I tend to overestimate the cost, versus a new construction of 5 to 7, and I would use the stainless liner. Doesn't mean you have to, but that's what I was thinking, of 5 to 7 million. The lifespan of the first one was 10 years. So if you divide that figure by 10, that's your yearly cost. And then the other one, I think the lifespan of that was 30 years.
For the walls themselves is 25, or it's not the lifespan, that's the warranty. The warranty of the stainless steel walls is 25 years. Their lifespan's expected to go much further than that.
So say 50, so you would divide that by 50 on a yearly cost, and then how much money do we have available? And I haven't reviewed that, so I would trust that you folks do that, and then hopefully by the end of today, we would come up with whether we're going to modify the existing pool or build a brand new one.
And I think that's the big ticket decision at this point, is new pool versus retrofitting the current one. Again, I mentioned the cost of concrete overall maintenance. When you're looking at $50,000 every 5 to 7 years to redo the painting alone versus $85,000 to redo a liner every 12 to 15 years.
So my gut would be, if we have the money available in a way that is socially acceptable, that we would build a brand new one, but I haven't looked at it in depth, and if you folks, either one's acceptable. So.
Val?
Well, I think I tend to lean towards the newer stainless steel, and I will say that because I have a stainless steel pool with a liner at my house, and I will tell you that we've had it for 35 years, and we just last summer put on our 4th liner. And I will tell you that the cost of chemicals is much lower than it would be if you're on top of it and you know what you're doing. So I like that idea. I was kind of tantalized by the idea of being able to have the people come out and see what could be done with our current pool, whether that was something that cost-wise we could do. Because in the beginning, part of my purpose was to have the retractable roof, or have something so that so we could extend the life of the pool. Because one of the reasons that I like that pool, or like having a pool, is for swim lessons. Not only, swim team, which of course is important for me, but also being able to do swim lessons for children in at least the shoulder seasons before and after. And I had hoped that by doing some sort of a retractable cover or something, we could extend the usage of the pool. So I don't know if that's a possibility. I hadn't really looked at the fact that having the workforce and having somebody to run the pool is going to be more of an expense as well. So I guess I just want to talk more about how time-wise it would be to have somebody come out and take a look at what it would cost if we were to extend and take the pool that we have now, convert it to the hybrid, or convert it to the other type of pool, and have them add on what that would look like. Because now I am somewhat interested in that, but I don't know how the rest of the council feels.
Brian, then Kurt.
So with the option to rehabilitate, it's going to be a lot more than $500,000. The pool building needs either replaced or completely renovated. All of the mechanical systems need completely replaced. So, you know, that was a lowball number. It is not going to be $500,000 to get that facility back up to spec. So don't get too caught up on that low number. I am interested in the possibility of having a more extended season for the pool. I'm not sure exactly how that's done. I don't know how feasible a retractable roof is, but Ashland does not have a retractable roof, and they're just running the heat more so they can have are they doing year-round at that pool?
Their plan is to do year-round. I'm not sure if they currently are.
Okay. But if you have a year-round pool, you're obviously spending more money in heating costs, and you're obviously spending more money in operational costs with staff and everything. But on the other side, you can also sell memberships and have more revenue coming in because it's a year-round facility. So those costs can be essentially offset by having a facility that everybody knows is open all the time. So it will get much higher utilization than a 60-day-a-year pool will get. To me, it's almost silly that we would be spending this much money for a facility that's going to be open 60 days a year. I personally would like to try to find a way to have a more extended season as we continue the conversations down the road. But as far as the pool structure itself, you know, Parks Committee originally recommended a new pool. The Parks Task Force, after the committee, recommended a new pool, and I thought council had already given direction, and that's what we wanted to do at previous meetings. So I thought it was pretty clear that was kind of the plan and where we were going.
Kurt, then DJ.
You mentioned that the membrane would fade. How much of the degradation of the membrane or requirement to replacement would be due to UV?
I don't know at this point. They just fade over time because they're exposed and things like that. If you've got a solid cover on it, it really just depends on the way you maintain your pool. Not all of them fade. Yeah, a lot of it just depends on what level of maintenance you're doing on your end.
My question really is, would the retractable roof extend the life of the membrane?
I don't know that, but I will say if you're looking at having some sort of closed indoor pool, retractable roof style system, we'd be looking at what's called a natatorium. That's an indoor pool. And with that, you then get into all the mechanical codes for the HVAC units. You have to have all sorts of specialized air handlers to pump external air in and out type of a thing, and it really does drive up the cost a lot. We don't have those figures, but you know, there's probably a reason Ashland's going outdoors as opposed to putting a roof on it.
Even a retractable cover that's open on the sides would require that?
It definitely require permitting, and it's just to the level of what they require after that. But essentially, you would be creating a housing location for an altered environment, whether it's chlorine or anything like that. And something like that may not necessarily help you in smoke events or anything. Our aquatic center in Corval is the natatorium on it. We had, you know, great HVAC system and everything like that, but even on our big smoke days, we'd have to look at possibly closing down that facility just because the outside air comes in, and although it's filtered, it doesn't break up all the particulates that get into that facility.
I'd still be curious if the manufacturer warranted an inside membrane differently than an outside membrane.
No, I believe it's a standard pretty much across the board 10-year.
Thanks.
All right, we had a question about whether, I guess, to what degree the school district, we've talked about regarding parking other than just a general willingness. I guess, who did we speak to at the school district, and kind of what did we talk about?
Danny, I'm sorry, I just lost his last name because he's brand, he's pretty new, not new with the district, but new into this business position. Since Sherry, I'm sorry? Cantola. Since Sherry is retiring in a week or two. So he was the main person, as well as their maintenance person, Nate. So those are the two that we met with. And your question, Mayor, about the parking, I mean, I think they expressed a lot of interest in the benefits to their side of having the increased parking. To Councilor Lovelace's point about the extended season, there was some questions about how that would work if you have a lot of overlap of the swim season while school is in session. And if the parking, is, I mean, are these things that couldn't be worked out? Probably not, but I think it is definitely an important discussion because, they're unable to commit at this point until we really give them a much firmer answer about whether we want to use that land really just for parking or also to expand the pool facility itself. And in which case we would probably need to look at more of a purchase or lease kind of situation.
And same for the hill part, the grass within the pool fence.
Right. Same
Okay.
with that, yeah.
Does that answer your question, DJ?
Yes, thank you.
Are there other questions? All right, I guess we'll kind of move into more of a discussion phase. And DJ, you have something?
Yeah, just briefly. Generally, I'm in favor of just raise the land and rebuild the pool. I mean, Brian mentioned that there's infrastructure issues, there's pipes in the ground, there's possible leaks, it's built in the 50s. I mean, I would just be very nervous about that upcoming, that ongoing maintenance cost of a half-built pool at this point. So I would raise it, I'd rebuild it, and I am totally okay with going with a higher upfront cost of getting a quality product that's going to last longer and have theoretically lower maintenance costs. So I'd be prone to also make that decision. I'm also in favor of different amenities that goes along with raising it. I also see that as being a benefit. If we raise this, then we're going to have a larger slate with room for hot tubs or toddlers pools or even some shaded areas. So, I'm willing to be a little bit liberal up front to have a very nice area for a community pool.
Okay, Rob, then Rick.
Yeah, I think I agree with DJ and Brian that initially we already, in a certain sense, and it didn't take very long for us to get past that part of the discussion, that for all the reasons DJ just mentioned, we have an ongoing can of worms with all the old, with the old technology and the old facilities that are there. I also have to believe that, brand new heating system is going to cost a fraction of the cost to run. With, I just don't see us, adding a lot of new parts to a 60-year-old car and expecting to get much performance out of it. So it makes probably more sense long-term to start fresh there, and we can customize what we want. It is very attractive, to spend less money, of course. I mean, who doesn't like that? But we're just not, as Brian said, we're not going to get out of that for $500,000. It's and then at what point it really doesn't make sense to put a lot of money in there, because we're going to have ongoing problems. How many days of use will we lose if something goes down? There'll be certain days we won't be able to be open, maybe weeks, maybe longer if we can't get parts and so forth. So I don't really want to put that on a future staff or a future council to have to deal with those predictable problems.
Rick.
I'm going to take the opposing view of being a little more frugal. I would be supportive of rehabilitation of the hybrid model. I owned a above-ground swimming pool and had the same liner in it for 30 years, but I was very particular in maintaining it. One thing that concerns me, if we put a significant amount of money, and I'm talking $3 to $5 million into a pool. And if we're unable to have lifeguards and we find ourselves closing this pool down because of that, we have that money we put in there and there's no way of returning it. So getting a return for our investment. So thank you.
Other discussion? We need to, I guess I could count up how many of us are in favor. I think the majority, I'm not sure we've heard from Kurt, but that everybody's in favor of rebuilding except for Rick was interested in the rehab. What do you think, Kurt?
Well, I always say everybody in this town goes a full 90% of the way. So I think we should pass on the old and do a new one and do it right.
Okay, that was the previous decision we already
Yeah.
made, so I think at this point, it sounds like we're in agreement of pushing forward with a new pool, but we need to decide on some features or where we want to go from here. And Val, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had that follow-up question that you had about the end, and that's obviously, because I also thought that belonged to the city, the grassland that they always use. I didn't realize that belonged to but after listening to everything, and you're right, obviously anything we do to the pool, we're going to have to upgrade the pool house and that sort of thing, and that's obvious. That's going to need to happen, and you're right. I was down there, I took a look at the mechanical system, and the reality of it is we just need, I think, to do it and move forward. So I am going to say, something from Vanessa also mentioned, and I also have a solar heating, which I love, and I replaced, and I think Southern Oregon is the best place possible to have solar heating if possible, and I think it would be worth going out and looking if we can also get a grant, because I know Hood River did get a grant for solar heating for their pool system. So I would like to make that a part of it going forward in using solar heat and natural gas as the two means by which to go it. But I'm going to say let's go for the new one. I would suggest we use the newer system, the steel with the membrane. I also like the combination of the swim team and the community pool, so have the two. I also would like to have diving boards, because I do think that's something that I know I have been able to keep my diving board because I haven't really replaced anything, and it is a highlight for people who come to my house, and a pool. I don't know that I necessarily need a hot tub there myself, but that's my own thought. So I will go ahead and say new with combined use, if that helps our decision, getting some direction.
Okay.
I was going to say, I was actually looking at Vanessa's, and she basically said, same thing, exercise, water, walking area in the shallow end, diving boards, water slide, sunshades, new locker room, restrooms, additional parking, and a toddler pool. So those are the things that she put in, and she also did favor the metal option. So there you go.
Okay. Did you have a hand up, Brian? No? Okay. How much detail do you need from us? I mean, it sounds like we need to pursue some serious discussions with the district, both about how we can use that green space as well as the parking area. And then we need to put an RFP out for design.
No, and this conversation helps us. It really does, because I feel like we'll proceed with, talking to some designers about the stainless steel with the membrane, and then a potential hybrid use. It sounds like there's quite a bit of interest in having both of those, and that would potentially include that movable bulkhead.
Yes.
To be able to do that. So we will proceed with that, and then see, once we actually get a couple of layout options, that'll give us something specifically to bring back to the district, because I think at this point, further discussions, are not really fruitful, because they're not able to respond to anything on paper, and really kind of dive into it. So based on this conversation today, unless you have additional, we'll take this, get it laid out with an RFP, and then we can have that conversation with the district.
Okay. Does anybody have questions or comments? Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, it just seems to me that if we were going to have a joint effort kind of on that extra parking area, clearly, even if we end up with a pool that has shoulder seasons or even a winter season, there's not going to be that much use in the shoulder or the winter season. So I would think that any parking that we are adding for the school district, or put it this way, I can't imagine that extra lot's going to be filled to capacity in November with swimmers. So I don't, when we talk to the school district about that, I'm sure that I would think that should be brought out, that obviously in the summer when there's no classes, we're going to be using that lot. And the other seasons, even if we go with a 3-season or 4-season pool, I still think it's going to be a net gain of parking for the school district. I think it'll still be a plus for them. And where did I read somewhere, was it in the presentation, that the school district was amenable to us continuing to use that grassy area? I mean, I read that somewhere. And today it sounds like we don't know the answer to that, but I did read that. Huh?
Well, it sounds like they're open to it, but we also talked to staff instead of to the school board, and I think that maybe building something, I mean, I had kind of imagined that we almost might build, some extra features like a splash pad, but if the city doesn't own that, keeping it as grassy space versus building something on it's kind of different.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Comments, questions? All right. How about agenda review? Our next meeting, next Monday, so we have the discussion about counselor pay, as well as a follow-up on the ARPA plans. And then we have a meeting next Wednesday that has a public hearing to consider a middle housing code, a development code text amendment for the middle housing code, regarding HB House Bill 2001. We have an ordinance that would designate the Ford building as a historic landmark, as well as the Wonderbur and the Clark McConnell House. We have an ordinance that would be a street plug vacation for Southview subdivision. We have a public hearing on state shared revenues and city budget, a public hearing on the Urban Renewal Agency budget. And then we have council action items and ordinance regarding the Woodbrook Drive Improvements Reimbursement District, resolution for the URA project reallocation, a resolution for state revenue sharing, a resolution for levying taxes, a resolution for adopting budget. These are a bunch of budget-related things that we do on an annual basis. Council action item that would be a resolution to replace the water treatment plant Phase 1B design services, a resolution to adopt the URA Urban Renewal Agency budget, a resolution to approve commercial use in Riverside Park, a resolution to make an interphone loan to the Bancroft Fund, a resolution for the Josephine County Assessor delinquent sewer charges, a resolution for tax receipts, a resolution for the Urban Renewal Agency tax receipts, a resolution to accept funding from High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, a resolution for a food truck pilot program at Riverside Park, a resolution for adding active local builder developer to Housing Advisory Committee, a resolution awarding the C Street water line replacement project, a resolution authorizing a grant application for the Lincoln Road Improvements Project, a resolution for a school violence prevention program grant, a resolution for Safe Roads to School grant application, a resolution for an accreditation support grant, and a motion to acknowledge the monthly financial report, and then appointing committee members to the Historic Building and Sites Commission, the Parks Advisory Committee, and the Bikeways Walkways Committee. That was a lot of things. Anybody have questions? All right. And then the June 20th workshop will cover permanent funding for public safety, as well as some small cell tower and cell tower design standards that was initially scheduled for today, but we moved that last week. All right, go ahead, Rob.
So next week for the workshop, I imagine that there'll be a slideshow about counselor pay, I imagine. So, Aaron, do you know yet what you're going to include in that, or where that's going to go, or have you already started it?
I have not started it yet, but the concept would be that I would provide you with the details on what it's going to take in order for you to get counselor pay and how does that relate to the charter. Have some surveys of some other communities and what they had for their counselor pay in relation to the city of Grants Pass, and then potential funding sources or something along those lines. If there's something more specific, then please let me know and I'll include that.
Karen, I have a question. The volunteer dinner on the 23rd, is that being postponed until the fall?
It is. I just forgot to take it off the
Okay.
future agenda.
Okay, that is being postponed until the fall. Val?
Yes, I know that I've heard in a couple of discussions that we've had regarding the destination marketing organization and the transient lodging tax, that a couple of people had asked about when there was going to be an update. And I talked with Tori, and she said she originally heard, she wasn't really sure. She'd given some information to Aaron. She didn't know whether she needed to give a presentation in June or what was up with that. I know that there's been a couple questions and things brought up about using our tourism advisory committee in certain ways, and maybe having some sort of a grant for, you know, events or whatever. So I don't know at what time we want to put that on the agenda. So I guess that's my question, is that we can get something on the agenda. Yes, Karen has her hand up in the back.
I emailed Tori, and she's available July 11th. Okay. We just hadn't had an agenda setting meeting since then, and so I have that noted for Aaron to talk with the mayor about.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, does that answer your question? Okay, Aaron?
I just had one item. There is a council memo on the dais with regards to the community development block grant minor amendment. If you could take a look at that and review it. There is a time sensitivity issue with that, because we would like to be able to administratively allocate some of those funds to some programs. I think it's housing, Habitat for Humanity, and Brad can highlight that. And if you concur with those, they can get going to utilizing those funds right away, which is the key for the block grant dollars, is to try to get the low to moderate income uses. And so I don't know, Brad, if you want to highlight any more than that.
No, I mean, I think the council, or the memo kind of highlights it. I think, you know, if we do have, as the council knows, quite a bit of funding from prior CDBG program years that has, you know, not been spent. And so we really do need to, you know, just kind of keep this money moving so that HUD can see that we're spending it in a wise way. So that's kind of the motivation behind it.
Brian, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a couple questions. How did this opportunity arise in the first place? Did Habitat for Humanity approach staff, or how did this materialize?
That's a good question. And Habitat had owned this property up there off of Redfin for several years, but had not done anything with it. And then actually started a conversation with Home Bridging, Grants Pass, who Chad is here today actually with Home Bridging. And so they worked out an arrangement where they, you know, now own the property, and Home Bridging and Habitat will both have lots. There's 22 lots in that subdivision. And so I think that basically kicked off the conversation that once it was approved by the Planning Commission, you know, what are some ways to get the infrastructure there? And so that's where they contacted Ann, and she gave him information that the Community Development Block Grant offers assistance for infrastructure.
Okay, that's great. What are the requirements around the use of the CDBG money with regards to, I would assume that there are strings attached with regards to equitable treatment with regard to applicants and users of the program. So do we have all those assurances in place that the home bridging program weighs applicants in a fair and equitable manner?
So there's a subrecipient agreement that is required as part of our HUD. You know, as an entitlement community, we have to enter into entitlement or subrecipient agreements, and those outline all federal rules. To this point, home bridging has not, you know, delved into, I don't think, all the details of that subrecipient agreement. What we have had are numerous emails back and forth on, you know, the funding itself for the sewer and water and street improvements. But you know, they would be required under our consolidated plan. Otherwise, we would not be able to issue them any money to comply with those rules. So they would have to sign that subrecipient agreement that outlines those before we would be able to issue any money.
Okay, so that's going to be signed before funds are distributed?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would have to be in place. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Val?
I guess my question is, because I did read this, I mean, because this is on the dais, but you did email it to us as well. So I guess my question is, we've got the memo. In order for it to happen, I'm assuming we have to go through a council action to do it. Am I correct? Or how does that work?
So the minor amendments do not, as long as no more than 25% of a program year's total funding is reallocated, the public participation plan that council approved 5 years ago doesn't require council action for minor amendments. So anything over 25%, we would have to hold a public hearing, but the city manager actually has authority to sign off on minor amendments.
Okay, so I just want to clarify then. So basically, you're just letting us know this, and if we have an objection to it, we would contact you. Otherwise, you want to thumbs up, thumbs down from us, because I mean, I support it. I just don't know exactly the next step.
In essence, I thought it was important that you knew where those monies can go and how and there is a time sensitivity for one of these projects to potentially utilize these. So I wanted to get the information out there, and if there is any concerns, then to let me know, and we can schedule a workshop or a business meeting and have a discussion on it.
Okay, and I think basically the point that Brian brought up about the fact that any CBDG funds, they would have to sign on to all those fair housing and all those sorts of things in terms of, in order to receive the money, is important to know. So, thank you.
So in terms of the timeliness, if we give the council a week or until next Wednesday, something like that, just because some people may have read it over the weekend and other people maybe didn't, is that sufficient, or what's the timeline that's needed?
So I think the main thing that's driving it is the civil plans for the subdivision, have gone through the approval process. The Public Works has reviewed those, and for the summer season, contractors have been lined up and sort of kind of ready to roll. They're not able to begin any work until a subrecipient agreement is entered into. No shovel can hit the ground under HUD rules before CDBG money is issued until that's that agreement's signed up. And so I guess to answer your question, if council needs that time, then you need that time. I think they're, from a contracting standpoint, they're ready to roll.
Okay, so any day they're ready to go at this point.
Yeah.
Rob?
Yeah, so I looked at the information about home bridging that I guess is on Edgewater Church's website, and it's really impressive. And it'd be awesome if every church in town had a similar program. It really seems like it's doing potentially a lot of good things. I have some serious concerns in that it really seemed like to participate in that program, a prerequisite was clearly to be a member of that church. Matter of fact, in the video that they have on that website, the quote was, one of the goals was planting missionaries all over the community. And they're, putting church members in these homes so they can be first-time homeowners and so forth and get out of the cycle of paying rent and all those excellent goals. But there was nothing whatsoever to tell me that Homebridging has any experience at all in any other type of, we'll say, charitable activity other than essentially promoting and improving the lives of their church members. I just would have to defer to Augustus as to whether or not that is even remotely close to appropriate funding or funding use for government funds, because what I saw on the website, it clearly didn't seem to be, but I would defer to someone else who knows more about the legalities.
I would have to take a look. That's something I could do.
I guess I'm personally fairly uncomfortable with council being asked to make a decision about something today that's not on the agenda, even though it's not something that really needs our approval. If you're asking, then we need to give people time to read through the materials and think about it. So, I mean, I don't know, council, if you're ready to give thumbs up today, or if this is something that we just need to hold off on for a week. Brian?
It'd probably be good to take a little time to get Councilor Pell's question answered and also to potentially review a draft of the sub-recipient agreement that would be utilized, if possible.
I was just thinking, it sounds like due to the conversation, maybe we should, if we can, schedule it for an upcoming workshop.
Okay, I think that seems good. We could even do it next week or the 20th. But yeah, just give people a little time if they're being asked to make a decision on something. Is there anything else that we want to add to a future agenda? We were in the middle of agenda review here. Brian?
Yeah, so I think there's, I was looking at the council handbook, and in section 5, it talks about remote attendance, and it says remote attendance shall be limited to 6 times per counselor per calendar year. So that's not being followed currently, and so I think that we need to address that at some point here soon. And then also the next section talks about, in the same vein, it says a counselor must be physically present to attend any executive session, which we are about to go into. So I think we need to have a discussion soon about clarifying that.
Okay, council, are you interested in having a discussion about remote meeting rules? Rob, yes? All right, 2 people are interested in having that discussion.
I mean, it's in resolution and we're not following it right now, so there needs to be some clarification that happens, or we can just continually be not following resolution.
Okay, well, we will look into that anyway. Aaron.
I had another agenda item, just clarification if I could. I wanted to make sure Augustus and I have clear direction on the, on the urban campground contract. So what's your expected call to action for our next item? Is it another workshop? Is it a business meeting approving the document? I just wanted further clarification because there was some things that I wrote down that we talked about that I want to make sure we hit the mark.
I guess I'm personally okay with it going to a business meeting as long as we have a presentation and discussion about the buffer zones in particular. other ideas? Rob?
And what, we had a few things that we put in as placeholders today that weren't finalized. Could you just read that list?
The two things that I have as placeholders are the 300 feet buffer from a residential zone, and then leaving case management as part of the services in paragraph 9. Those are the two placeholders that I have.
And we hadn't finalized on that section 12, we hadn't put anything to a vote or really seriously discussed the different options of either, 3 years, 6 years, no years. We hadn't finalized that today, I don't think, did we?
If I recall correctly, there was a majority to put in a termination stay for 3 years.
Yep. I have 5. We're interested in 3 years. Kurt, Rick, DJ, Valerie, and Joel. And it's not set in stone for what that's worth. Yeah. All right. So yeah, urban campground, I guess, business meeting. Is everybody okay with that? All right. Biz meeting. Anything else? All right. In that case, let's have a motion to move into executive session.
I make a motion to move into executive session.
Is there a second? Kurt with the second. All in favor of moving into executive session? Any opposed? All right. We will take a 10-minute recess and come back at 3:40.